May 40 here. So there's a haunting prayer on the evening of Yom Kippur, which just came to mind shortly before I started this show. Who by fire, who by plague, Judaism's haunting prayer, the Unetaneh Tokef. So there's a great deal of uncertainty in life, but one thing we do know, we will all die, but there are certain ways of living that increase your likelihood of having a long and healthy life, and there are other things that you can do that dramatically increase your odds of an early and untimely and unnecessary death. But no matter your program, right, we are all incredibly mortal and vulnerable. So this is the Yom Kippur prayer. On Rosh Hashanah, the decree is inscribed, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed. How many will pass away and how many will be created? Who will live and who will die? Who will come to his untimely end and who will come to his timely end and who to an untimely end? Who will perish by fire and who by water? Who by the sword and who by beast? Who by hunger and who by thirst? Who by earthquake and who by the plague? Who by strangling and who by stoning? Who will be at rest and who will wander? Who will have serenity and who will be confused? Who will be tranquil and who will be tormented? Who will become poor and who will become wealthy? Who will be brought to a low state and who will be uplifted? And then this was turned into a song by Leonard Cohen called Who by Fire, a haunting song released in 1974. And who by a fire, who by water, who in the sunshine, who in the nighttime, who by high ordeal, who by common trial, who in your merry, merry month of May, who by very slow decay, and who, shall I say, is calling? And who in her lonely slip, and who by barbiturate, who in these realms of love, and who by something blunt, who by avalanche, who by powder, who for his greed, who for his hunger, and who, shall I say, is calling? And who by brave ascent, who by accident, who in solitude, who in this mirror, who by his lady's command, who by his own hand, who in mortal chains, who in power, and who, shall I say, is calling?
You go up the front sidewalk, and the stairs lead to nothing. And this is a situation we're seeing all across L.A. County. I just talked to a neighbor next door. She was lucky to return to her property. She said she was looking for heirlooms and things like that. I talked to another gentleman in this area. He says he's acting like neighborhood watch, taking videos of suspicious people, their license plates, and this
Here's what he had to say. I mean, just knowing somebody's there watching you, you know, like the old-fashioned, you know, neighborhood watch where they know somebody's watching them. They're less likely to do things.
Neighborhood watch, taking video. Yep. The new L.A. County District Attorney Nathan Hochman, who is supposed to be the tough on crime DA, says that people who are caught looting will be maximally punished. He's expected to make an announcement within the hour on people who have been charged with crimes in relation to the aftermath of these fires. As of this hour, the total number of dead, 24 people across L.A. County. Earlier today, the sheriff says that number has been growing by the day because they've been finding human remains every day. Charles.
Matt, thank you very much. California Governor Gavin Newsom is calling for a massive rebuilding effort and suspension of regulations. To Jonathan Hunt in the Pacific Palisades with this part of the story. Jonathan.
And Charles, it will take a massive rebuilding effort. When you look around pretty much every street in the Palisades and where Matt is in Altadena, this is what you see: destruction in every direction. And we're not talking about a couple of houses on each street, Charles. On a lot of streets in the Palisades, and I mean dozens of streets, if not hundreds of streets, almost every home is gone. Almost every home looks like this. And you go...
So I'm noticing some trends in the news media, and that is the right-wing media is very quick to attribute this widespread destruction due to poor choices made by leading Democratic Party politicians. So virtually all important politicians who have power in California or in the Democratic Party. And in the conventional mainstream media, I see a narrative that this has nothing to do with politics, except to the extent that it's tied to global warming. And in the face of these horrific winds, that essentially firefighters and politicians and everyone who wanted to plan and organize and fight back was just absolutely helpless in the face of terrifying winds. So on the right, very quick to find fault, and on the left, not so quick to find fault with the ruling powers in California. And this direction would be moving in the opposite way if Republicans were in power and we had this type of disaster. So when Republicans are in power, then the news media, they focus on what are the mistakes made by the Republicans, and it's the conservative media who often tries to place things in wider context and say, look, there were these unstoppable forces of a hurricane, etc. So the way we view the world is going to have a strong partisan political tinge if we take politics seriously. And you see this coming out right now. Another difference in this story and many other stories is that people on the right overwhelmingly believe that individual choices matter a great deal, while people on the left believe that it's not so much individual choice that shapes the world around us. It is primarily structural forces. It's primarily society. It's socioeconomic forces. It is Marxist analysis that enables us to understand all these different forces that are driving people. And I come in the middle there. I don't think it's just primarily freedom of choice, and I don't think it's just primarily economic forces or wider forces. We need both are influential. But here's an example of the conservative perspective, right? All of these homes around this particular house were burnt up, but some homes withstood the LA fires. And we have an article in Bloomberg, Architects Explain Why. And this is a development upon the themes that I hit on yesterday's show, that fire is not some unstoppable process. So the way this story is presented in the conventional news media, it's that fire is like a tsunami. It's just some unstoppable process, and politicians and firefighters are just absolutely helpless in the face of these fires. That's the dominant story that we're given. But fire is not just a process. It requires ingredients, right? And if you remove those ingredients from the picture, then you are not going to have fire. So I'm looking at New York Magazine, left-wing source, and they interview a professor of environmental history at Pomona College, who one would expect is also on the left. And this catastrophe was entirely foreseeable, says the professor. When were the seeds sown? Well, over 100 years ago, when people started moving into Pasadena and into the low foothills and what would become Altadena, and they had cars, and cars are very dangerous. We bring fire with us. We've had Santa Ana winds for millennia, but now we have this outward surge of people, right? It's the people who are at fault. We've got people living in these dangerous areas, right? And so we have an outward surge of population, which has led to these very dangerous large fires that are essentially structure fires, not wildfires. So what the firefighters want to do is herd the fire into wildlands away from structures. But when you've got winds of 50, 60 miles an hour and gusts up to 100 miles an hour, there's no way you can fight that fire. None. Aerial attack is grounded when winds are over 40 miles an hour. So there's one incident commander said, at 10 miles per hour, I'm a firefighter. At 30 miles per hour, I am an observer. So last Tuesday night, there were no planes flying because the wind was too severe. Boots on the ground were doing heroic work, but couldn't do much. So this is the dominant ethos from the mainstream media, that Los Angeles was essentially helpless, and its Democratic politicians were essentially helpless in the face of an unstoppable force. There's nothing that could have stopped this fire, right? Here you've got this environmental professor telling us There's nothing that could have stopped this fire. And you hear this again and again and again from the mainstream media. I don't care how many fire engines you might have had, how much water might have been at your disposal. This thing was moving way too fast. Every firefighter was fighting as hard as they could. And the topography of the Pacific Palisades is brutal. Some of the steepest slopes you'll find anywhere. There was not enough water to pump up to the higher elevations. And we need to stop building close to wildlife and to this kind of bush and trees. But it's that ethos that humanity was essentially helpless in the face of these fires. But you look and you see that some fires survived and others did not. So why the heck was that? Why was it that some homes survived and other homes did not? Right? If you remove the ingredients for fire, you don't have as much fire. So there are fire-resilient design strategies. And people ignore the incentives to create fire-resilient homes because California voted to restrict the ability of private offerings of home insurance and to restrict those prices. So people are not getting the incentives that they need to make the right decisions.
This is Joe McCormick from Stuff to Blow Your Mind. Did you know over the course
open source AI model to help radiologists double-check their diagnosis?
Patrick had started his morning with a walk in his neighborhood.
It's up on the bluffs of the Palisades. It's a magical place.
Hours later, he was told to evacuate. A brush fire that sparked on Tuesday morning near the Pacific Palisades had started to spread.
All right, so there are all sorts of fireproofing decisions that people could have taken. They could have had a protected yard, free of vegetation, fenced off by concrete garden walls. They could have done landscaping in a sparse Mediterranean desert style, right? Owners could have removed trash cans and other loose items from around the house, even left the gate open, knowing that a fire can spread along a fence to a house. If people don't park their cars adjacent to homes, right, cars can burn up to 1,200 degrees, and they're quite dangerous, quite flammable. Then there are all sorts of design factors that will significantly reduce the chances of your home burning up, right? No eaves, no overhangs, because these can form eddies or trap embers blown by high winds. This particular house doesn't have any attic vents to allow sparks to get inside the roof, which is metal, has a fire-resistant underlay. The house is simple. It's front gabled without multiple roof lines, dormers, or other pop-outs, which are vulnerable intersections in a fire. The walls of the house have a 1-hour fire rating. The deck is Class A wood, so it's resistant to ignition, as resistant as concrete or steel. Tempered glass protects the interiors. The front of the house was built with heat-treated wood, shielded from flying sparks and embers by the extruding walls and a roof line. So you practice best practices for reducing ignition to a fire and the spread of fire, and you wouldn't have had all these homes and businesses burning down. Right? So there are things that we can do that increase the chances that we will live and that our home will live. A biggest predictor for how buildings fare in a wildfire is often just their age. So newer homes are required to comply with much higher standards of construction. So some of the homes in Pacific Palisades that burned out were 90 years old. They had very little fire protection. If you remodel a home, you can make changes and you can make it much more fire resistant. But most people don't do those things. They were more interested in a nice new kitchen or bath. Now, some people, however, there have been hundreds of renovations in Southern California to make homes more fire resistant. And this particular architect drove along a stretch of beach in Malibu this week. He counted 5 houses left standing. 3 were his own projects.
Spurred on by the notoriously strong Santa Ana winds.
The smoke was hellacious. I put stuff in 2 big boxes of just memorabilia and photographs.
By Thursday, the neighborhood that Patrick described as magical had been destroyed. That Palisades fire and several others that erupted in Los Angeles County this week have now burned over 29,000 acres. Nearly 180,000 residents have been told to leave their homes.
They call it a war zone, apocalyptic. It's unbelievable.
It is on track to be one of the most destructive in the area, possibly ever.
That's Leslie Kaufman, a Bloomberg reporter who covers climate change, including its effects on the insurance industry. She says it will take time to put out the fires that are still ravaging Los Angeles, and even more time for residents like Patrick to figure out next steps and assess the damage. Patrick heard that the house next to his burned down, and thinks his must have too.
I don't think anything is going to be there. The heat of that fire, I would be surprised if there.
Gavin Newsom has been talking a great deal about Trump-proofing California. He's got the entire legislature on board with Trump-proofing California. Now, he could have used that time, attention, and effort to fireproof California, but instead he put a priority on stopping Donald Trump instead of putting a priority on fireproofing. So the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power in 2019 sought to widen a fire access road and replace old wooden utility poles in the Topanga Canyon abutting the Pacific Palisades with steel ones to make these power lines fire and wind resistant. Right, this is from the Wall Street Journal. In the process, crews removed an estimated 119 milk vetch plants, an endangered species. The utility halted the project as state officials investigated the plant destruction. More than a year later, the California Coastal Commission issued a cease and desist order, fined the utility $2 million, and required mitigation for the project's impact on the species. So that meant replacing non-native vegetation with plants native to the state. So California's progressives want to expel foreign flora and fauna, but simultaneously provide a sanctuary for illegal human immigrants. Now, this particular endangered species, the milk vetch, requires wildfires to propagate. So the only way to boost its numbers is to let the land burn. So from the perspective of many environmentalists, every human is a colonizer. So we didn't get the fire-resistant power poles because there was some weed that we needed to protect. Now, the average Los Angeles Fire Department employee makes $200,000 a year in salary and $100,000 a year in benefits. Right? They're getting $300,000 a year, and they retire often at 55 with pensions equaling 90% of their final salaries. So LA spent $350 million this year on firefighter pensions and benefits, and hardly anything on fire prevention. The Los Angeles Fire Department has 9 DEI positions, and the Los Angeles Fire Department chief put as her priority diversity, inclusion, and equity. So limited union contracts and DEI illustrate LA's wrong-headed priorities. We haven't retained water that we need. We've allowed billions of gallons of water flushed out to the Pacific Ocean each year. We've got chronic water shortages. It's so hard to even wash your hands if you're in any kind of building, and they have all these rules about taps. You're not allowed to turn on a tap. You have to put your hand under the faucet, and then sometimes it turns on, sometimes it doesn't. So we repeatedly reduce the quality of life for people to try to boost the prospects of some weed and some little fish. And then consider our state's response to crime and homelessness, which often contributes to these fires. Last year's Park fire, the 4th largest in state history, was started by a guy with 2 prior felony convictions who was on parole for DUI. LA Times reported in early 2021, 24 fires on average were breaking out each day in LA's homeless encampments. Fire in a homeless encampment shut down the major LA freeway, the 10, last November. Second time that happened in a little over a year. We had citizens on Thursday detain a homeless man who was using a flamethrower to incinerate Christmas trees and garbage cans the same time that these major fires were erupting. And then we have police arresting a vagrant on a felony probation violation, meaning he was already on parole for another felony because he was using a blowtorch to smoke marijuana and possibly commit arson. So that's some of what's going on here in California.
California has become the poster child for everything that is wrong with socialism in America, from homelessness, crime, failed political decisions, ridiculous restrictions on business operations, freedoms, the Green New Deal fraud, electric car mandates, and no power stations to charge them, and providing sanctuary for criminal illegals and exorbitant taxes. Governor Gavin Newsom has squandered every state and federal tax dollar he has ever received. He refused to build large water retention reservoirs and capture and redirect the rainwater and snowfall that drains into the Pacific Ocean from Northern California. He destroyed 4 dams to allow salmon fishing and prevented construction of a retention facility with a dam due to a small 2-inch fish called a smelt, which could have been used as a water diversion method to handle the water storage, especially with regard to fighting fires. Newsom and his predecessors, pressured by green environmentalist groups, failed to implement controlled burns to remove volatile dry underbrush, which spreads fire rapidly. As of this recording, the fires fueled by the strong Santa Ana winds have destroyed more than 1,000 homes and businesses and taken 5 lives, but that number may grow. Firefighters had to leave burning structures because there was no water pressure in the fire hydrants due to the failure of the local and state leadership to be prepared, despite billions of dollars being taken in by that state's government. They could have built pumping stations to draw water from the Pacific Ocean or firefighting, and even built desalination and purification sites to distill that water for human consumption, farming, and other uses. Los Angeles Fire Department Fire Chief Kristen M. Crowley was selected by former Mayor Eric Garcetti and took the oath of office on March 25, 2022, becoming the first female and LGBTQ fire chief in the LAFD, and that seems to have been another self-inflicted wound. Crowley has her own priorities, and she stated this as such. She wants to increase DEI, didn't earn it, hires, as opposed to focusing upon getting the best people to serve their communities. But she is not alone in her idiocy. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, another Democratic failure, also faces intense criticism for cutting the fire department's budget by $17.6 million just a few months earlier in order to take care of the illegal aliens and the homeless, for which Gavin Newsom took billions in tax dollars for many years and promised to address that issue, but he failed miserably. Given the history of frequent destructive fires, this decision qualifies for high marks on the insanity meter. Remember, LA also reduced funding for their police department during the rabid defund the police movement by the Marxist left, and the recently ousted district attorney supported a long-running crime spree, letting violent criminals roam the streets. On December 12, 2022, Mayor Bass declared a state of emergency on homelessness, which had exploded under Newsom and is now home to more than a third of the nation's homeless population, despite Governor Gavin Newsom committing $24 billion to solve the crisis. But homelessness only exploded under his watch, and the money is gone. There was no accounting for where the money went after failed audits, but Newsom built a new $9 million home, and under Bass, the LA homeless situation has also grown exponentially. Since taking office in 2019, Newsom has overseen a state budget that has increased from $201.4 billion to $454.7 billion in 2023 with no visible benefit to the citizens. Go figure. Bass's program, called Inside Safe, will, according to Bass herself, cost just under $100 million. It will use master leasing with hotels to place the homeless. She said her office has been in touch with motel owners near the encampments. California has some of the highest taxes in the nation, the greatest restrictions on personal freedoms, illegal alien sanctuary policies, and increased crime, which also exploded, and insane laws and mandates that violate logic. There seemed to be a small glimmer of hope that the liberal idiocy was finally seeing logic when the citizens of LA County voted out DA George Gascon, the so-called godfather of progressive prosecutors. Under him, crime exploded, with minimal charges being given for major crimes and violent people who were arrested being allowed back out on the street on no cash bail to commit more crimes. These insane policies were all implemented by elected Democrats and socialist bureaucrats who, for some reason, the people of the state keep reelecting. The current destruction is a massive self-inflicted wound that I do not think the liberals living there have even acknowledged. Those who have seen the damage have left or changed their political affiliation.
All right, Megyn Kelly's talking
about... It's caught out in front of the fires by NBC's Jacob Soboroff, who is further left than Gavin Newsom. Trust me, I know him. I worked with him for a year plus at NBC and spent a fair amount of time with this guy. Very far left kid. And not a kid, but he's younger. And he starts asking Gavin Newsom a bunch of softball questions. And Newsom tries to spin that everything was filled. All the reservoirs were totally filled. I don't know what the hubbub is about. And Soboroff asks one follow-up question, pointing out that the reservoir that serviced Pacific Palisades was empty. Watch this.
When he talks about the Delta smelt and reservoirs, the reservoirs are completely full. The state reservoirs here in Southern California, that mis and disinformation, I don't think advantages or aids any of us. Responding to Donald Trump's insults, we would spend another month. I'm very familiar with them. Every elected official that he disagrees with, very familiar with them.
We do know, though, from reporting here locally that that one reservoir that serves the Palisades was not full.
And that's exactly what triggered my desire to get the investigation, to understand what was happening.
They believe, or the Washington Post, they believe that this fire in the Pacific Palisades was the result of a nearby fire that had started on New Year's Eve thanks to fireworks that they put out, but it was still smoldering. And with the high winds, it sort of jumped. Anyway, all of which is foreseeable. And he's going to die on the hill of, well, the locals didn't fill their reservoir, but the state reservoirs had water.
Amazing. I mean, the time to look into it is before the entire city burns to the ground. That's kind of the time you target as a governor, someone who's competent to look into such matters as not having water to fight fires. You don't look into it after you're just looking at a bunch of rubble. You look at it before the issue. That's entirely your job as governor, and he's failed at it over and over and over again. And that's going to be his fallout. Of course, he's going to be basically the multiple Spider-Man meme where everyone's just pointing fingers at each other. That's what's going to happen in California. They're all going to, I guess, decide to blame everybody. Of course, Donald Trump is going to get his share of the inexplicable blame. He's not even president of the United States yet, but this is still going to be his fault somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you do see this in the news media blaming Donald Trump for these fires because he hasn't promoted enough climate change legislation. Question in the chat, Luke, do Australians go to eat alone and go to movies alone as often as Americans? And my sense is no. So compared to Japan, Australia is quite individualistic, but it's still a more corporate, more high trust, more cohesive society. People have mates in Australia. There's a strong Australian tradition of male friendship. And so people don't walk alone through life nearly as much. And in the 1970s, I became a Liverpool fan. And one reason was so I'd never have to walk alone. Because Liverpool embraced this song by Jerry and the Pacemakers, You'll Never Walk Alone. It's a song that Liverpool fans sing. And this is true. If you're a sports fan, you're going to be more socially connected. You're going to be happier, and you're going to be more effective in life because you've got that high-intensity in-group that you can participate in. And when you walk through a storm, hold your head up high and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of a storm, there's a golden sky and the sweet silver song of a lark. And if your home burns down, you can go stay with a fellow Liverpoolian. Walk on through the wind. Walk on through the rain. For your dreams be tossed and blown. Walk on with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. If you're a Liverpool fan.
That's all out there. And this is something that, as you point out, someone like Ron DeSantis doesn't do. They look at this stuff in advance and try to fix it.
Okay, Lucy, the Dino Girl, what's going on?
Oh, hi, Luke. How are you doing? It's been a while since I spoke to you. How are you?
I'm blessed.
Just to say, you know, when you said Liverpoolian, it's actually Liverpudlian.
Ah, thank you for the correction.
That's all right. But how are you? Are the fires affecting you?
Sometimes the air can be just fine, crisp, clean, and then suddenly there's like a wave of ash and smoke. So it all depends on the direction of the fire. The wind. All that depends on the direction of the wind. Sorry.
What's your opinion on Mel Gibson's comments on the fire?
I didn't follow them. What did he say? Did he blame the libs?
No, what he thinks is that they were trying to burn down all the mansions because they wanted to build high capacity apartments because they could make a lot more rent if they had like big skyscrapers, you know, with many apartments in them. I mean, you know, that's not my opinion. That's Mel Gibson.
Yeah, no, I think that's nutty. He's often a terrific actor, but I don't think he's necessarily an accurate observer of what's going on in LA.
Do you think Hollywood will bounce back after this, or do you think that many of the stars, do you think they'll move elsewhere? Or
Hollywood, the entertainment industry is still here. So I don't know if you remember in the early days of the internet, there was all this talk, oh, now people won't have to live in a concentrated geographic area. They'll just be able to move anywhere they want in the world. But it really helps to be close to other people that you can meet up with in person. So the movie industry will still be dominantly based in Los Angeles because making movies is a highly collaborative thing, and you want to be socializing and spending as much time with your fellows in the industry. So there will not be a widespread exodus from LA for people in the entertainment industry.
You know, I've been following the newspaper, and I found it amazing how many small-time actors, like actors from soap operas in England, that have houses in LA, and it's like people that no one would know, but just these small, you know, maybe they have a small part in the EastEnders or something like that, and they actually have a house in LA. You know, I mean,
well,
the guy from
it's often a good investment, and even if you have just a small part in the entertainment industry, you probably have ambitions or dreams of a bigger part, and so the easiest way to make that happen is to be spending time with other people in the industry.
And Luke, how is your romantic life? Have you met someone?
Not recently, so my romantic life has been up and down, but I have never married, not yet.
Right. You know, I have to say, I'm in my 40s, and I have to say, some of the women nowadays that are 50 years old, they look absolutely fantastic, and it's very hard as a man to be able to match them because the women still look great in their 50s nowadays. You know, I'm not sure what it is, if it's surgery or just a fashion, but I didn't used to remember this always being the case, you know?
Yeah, so I think perhaps it's some things that they're doing, but in all likelihood, the age at which we become sexually attracted to the opposite sex, right? That begins in childhood when we first become attracted to the opposite sex. But then as we get older, it just keeps expanding. So when we were 12, we were not interested in 50-year-old women, but when we're 40, we can recognize that there are attractive 50-year-old women around us. So women look different as we age. We become open to a much higher age rate for the women around us, women who we previously would not have considered in a romantic or sexual life. 5 or 35.
And what sort of age range of a woman would you be looking for? Would you still be looking to have children at your age, or?
Yeah, so it would likely be preferably a woman who can still have kids, but not necessarily. Like if I met a great 52-year-old woman, then I would give up the dream of having kids if she was a great fit for me.
Yeah, I think, you know, when I was in my 30s, I always thought when I was like in my 30s, I always thought somehow even 30. I know 30 is not that young, but when I was in my 30s, I always thought life would work out and somehow I'd land and I'd be okay. But now I'm in my 40s. It's all changed, but I don't really even think about having children or something like that anymore. But if I could meet an older woman, that would be okay.
Yeah, so it has to be someone who's a fit for you. The type of woman that I'm attracted to might not be attractive to you, and vice versa. So there is an individual component to it, and particularly when the woman cares about you and she gets you, and you feel comfortable with her, then that will expand a whole realm of romantic possibilities that were not there initially. So often I might meet a woman, just not think about her in a romantic light. But then if we say work together, or we're going to the same synagogue together, or we're participating in the same social clubs together, and I see her over time, then she can wear me down. Then she can become much more attractive after a sustained series of pleasant interactions with her.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's actually true. Is that as a man, once I was past puberty and I was an adult, I could walk down the street, I could see an attractive woman, but it's not like you fall in love with them. But when you chat with a woman day to day, you can definitely become more attracted to them over time, and it can grow quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, particularly with plain women. This is something that I've often experienced. I look at a woman, just plain, nothing special there to grab the eye, but then her personality is amazing, or she has a particular smile, or a laugh, or you just so enjoy talking to her, and then suddenly all these pleasant interactions with her just completely transform how you feel about her, even though initially there was just nothing that grabbed you.
Do you find yourself when you meet a new interest? Do you find yourself creating your own backstory for them, or do you sort of just listen to what they tell you about themselves, or would you conjure up your own sort of idea about them?
Yeah, so I think when we fall in love, we're never falling in love with the reality of the person. We're falling in love with our fantasy about who they are. So I think as I age, I'm perhaps a little less likely to go into great sweeping visions of what their life is like, and I think I'm able to listen a little bit more carefully. But falling in love has all the elements of a mental illness. You usually don't fall in love with the reality of a person. You fall in love with your fantasy of who they are. But one of the best things about growing older is that you become more astute in how you assess other people and how you assess yourself, and there are fewer unpleasant surprises. I just feel much more at ease with myself, and so I'm much less likely to live in a world of delusion.
And do you think it is quite hard? Do you have quite a high standard, or do you find it difficult to find someone that or are there many potential candidates, do you think?
Somewhere in between. So, for example, I've never dated a woman who did not enjoy reading books. So even when I've dated ex-porn stars, they enjoyed reading books. So I think women who don't enjoy reading books, I would find quite boring. Also, I primarily just date women who are in Orthodox Judaism or who are close to Orthodox Judaism. So women who are open to the traditional Jewish way of life. So that tends to restrict the range of women who I date.
And do you think Los Angeles, where you live, do you think that has are the women very attractive there, or do you think there's other locations where because obviously Los Angeles, it has a sort of stereotype maybe that you've been describing in your videos. It's very ardently feminist, and are the women very sort of feminist, or are they feminine?
Well, there are generalizable differences, say, between the women in Los Angeles and the women in Tampa Bay. So the women in West Los Angeles tend to be attractive and they tend to be fit. And it's like the eastern suburbs of Sydney, near the ocean in Sydney. Everyone tends to be pretty fit, and disproportionate number of people are particularly good looking. And so in West LA, a lot of women who came here for the entertainment industry. So just a much higher proportion of stunning women compared to elsewhere. But there's still a significant number of just regular women who work in insurance, or they're hairstylists, or they work humdrum jobs. They're not in the entertainment industry. And probably what unites women and what unites men is probably far greater than geographic differences. So women tend to be looking for a man who will protect and provide and stay with them for the long term. And men have an inclination to try to have sex with as many beautiful women as possible.
Do you view yourself as sort of in the relationship as the dominant? Are you sort of dominant? You want to be the boss, or would you be comfortable with a woman that sort of bossed you around? It was that sort of a mum sort of figure character.
I am comfortable when we kind of divide up roles. So there are areas that I want to run things, and then I would hope that there are areas where she steps up. So when I date women who have a high degree of responsibility, where they're running organizations or they have very high pressure jobs, then they want me to make all the decisions with regard to where we go out, where we date, because so much of their energy is taken up with their career. And then after that, they just want to be passive. Mm-hmm. But I recognize I have blind spots, and she will always have blind spots. So it's nice when we can start apportioning things fairly quickly. It's like, oh, you're much stronger. You see this area of life much more clearly than I do, or I'll take the lead in this area. So when we can start playing to our strengths.
Do you think if you would have stayed in Australia and you would have lived somewhat a more, I don't know, more boring life, that you might have been married and had kids now?
Yes. Yeah.
And
because I just look at all the people I just look at all the people I grew up with, and they all got married and had kids.
And what would be more important to you, that you've sort of lived an interesting life and you've done, you've written a lot and you've sort of, you're sort of, you have a platform. Is that more important, or could you be happy just being sort of a humdrum guy with a couple of kids and a wife?
I think I could be happy either way. So I don't tend to spend much time in regret. But when I go back to Australia and I see my friends who I grew up with, and I see them with their kids, yeah, there is some pain in my heart. It's like, oh my God, if I'd never left here, like this would have been my life. I see that they have a much higher quality of life than I do.
Yeah, and I say that because I'm 40, I'm single, and it is very awkward when you don't have kids and you're 40. Like, even I think men that are divorced.
Yeah, we lost you there, but maybe you'll come back.
California is these mealy-mouthed, kale-eating.
Okay, you're back. Sorry, lost you.
Yeah, I say I'm sort of middle-aged, and I don't have kids, and it's very difficult to explain yourself when you're like 40 plus and you don't have kids. And if you're divorced and you had kids, people sort of, they feel more comfortable with you as just being sort of single guy. It's a very awkward situation.
Yeah, but how awkward? It's not incredibly awkward. It's just occasionally awkward. So here's the thing. People with a predisposition towards fear and anxiety will find reasons to have fear and anxiety over an infinite number of things. And then other people will just navigate those same situations with very little fear and anxiety. And so I don't find much social awkwardness in not having kids. So I don't think there's an inherent high degree of social awkwardness in not having kids, particularly these days when so many people don't have kids. But I just know so many people who are predisposed towards fear and anxiety. So all sorts of things that other people navigate without fear and anxiety, they get quite hung up in. So I think it's more about the individual and one's own tendencies towards fear and anxiety. Okay, are you still there?
Luke?
Yes.
Hello? Yeah, sorry, I'm going to go now.
Okay,
But,
cheers.
Thank you for taking my call, and
Yep.
I'll enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye now. Okay. What do we got here?
Before it happens. And Gavin Newsom has had multiple issues like this. I mean, if you go back to even his handling of COVID, which was horrid and horrific.
And I disagree. I think Gavin Newsom was great with regard to COVID, in particular being the first one to declare a state of emergency.
But one of the first things he did when he got into office, and this is covered in a Michael Lewis book, not a conservative author by any means, but they had an infectious disease expert who was running their health department for the state government. But the problem with her was she was white and blonde. And Gavin Newsom wanted a person of color in that role and hired someone who had absolutely no idea what they were doing whatsoever. This is not me talking about this. Again, this is a liberal author who describes the story in detail. And I'm sure I wouldn't have agreed with everything that an infectious disease expert would have recommended for COVID either. I probably would have my problems with it. But the idea that you would put someone in an important position like that before COVID, not knowing that it was coming, just putting someone in there who looked the way that you wanted them to look, going all out DEI with the lives of Californians, instead of picking someone who was already on staff and already lined up for the job, who was an infectious disease expert because she was white and blonde. This sort of stuff has been foundational to Gavin Newsom and the way he has run the state of California, and people shouldn't forget it. This is his fault. This is his fault. It's Karen Bass's fault, and he needs to be held responsible for it.
Now you've got the media, including CNN's fact checker, air quotes, Daniel Dale, trying to tell us that there was no shortage of water in LA. I mean, we know that the reservoir that serviced the area that burned to the ground was empty. But he's like, there's absolutely no problem with shortage of water in the LA area. Listen to this moron.
There is no shortage of water in the Los Angeles area. The reservoirs are at or above historical levels. The water is there. Now, we have seen high-profile issues in one part of the city, Pacific Palisades, where some hydrants were dry or did not have a lot of water. But that was not because there was not enough water in the region. That was because of technical, logistical, infrastructure issues.
Infrastructure issues. Okay, the LA Times on Friday, a Department of Water official acknowledged that the reservoir's absence, the one we're talking about for Palisades, likely contributed to some diminished pressure and dry hydrants in upper regions of the Palisades. The reservoir's absence, meaning look at this empty reservoir that serves Pacific Palisades, that it contributed to the diminished pressure and the dry hydrants. So how do you figure that there's no shortage of water in the LA area, Daniel Dale, and that this empty reservoir had no effect? Who died and made you fire chief or Department of Water investigator? He knows nothing, this guy. All he knows how to do is run cover for Democrats. They go on in the LA Times, to your point about Michael Lewis. This is no conservative publication. This is not the Wall Street Journal or the New York Post. They write, citing a former, that quote I read you was from a current DWP official. Now they go to a former general manager, a guy named Martin Adams. Had the reservoir been operable, it would have extended water pressure in the Palisades. It would have. Of course, because they ran out of water pressure in the upper parts of the Palisades once the lower parts of the Palisades were in trouble. And by the way, Janice, the woman who runs the Department of Water Works, came out and admitted all this already, Daniel Dale. What you have in California is these mealy-mouthed, kale-eating, broccoli-pushing, Birkstock, whatever, wearing politicians who can't find another person fast enough to blame. My absolute favorite, though, is the fire chief. She's growing on me. When she's not focusing on her lesbianism, she's actually quite fierce. She is not going down without bringing Mayor Karen Bass with her. And who could blame her? All right, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We begin with California Governor Gavin Newsom, who spent the weekend trying to avoid responsibility as the fires were still burning by dropping by the Pod Save America podcast for an attempt to clean up his own image.
I want to know the answers. So I'm the governor of California. I want to know the answer. I've got that question. I can't tell you about how many people, what happened. My own team saying what happened, and I want to get the answers. And
You're the governor.
I wasn't getting straight answers. Yeah. I watched the press conference. I met with some of those leaders. We had my team start talking to local leaders, saying what's going on. Our state,
and you weren't getting straight answers.
I was getting different answers. When you start getting different answers, then I'm not getting the actual story.
So you decided the thing to do would be to go on Pod Save America to talk about it, because in the end, it's all about you. This is another David Muir, folks. He is just as vain and worried about his image in the middle of this emergency as David Muir with his little fake fireman's jacket and clothespins in the back. It's the same person. The same person. Though I have to say Gavin Newsom's probably a little smarter than David Muir, but that's the bar's very low. Listen to this. He goes out there. Hold on a second. Do we have it here? It's SOT 4. It's Gavin Newsom talking on Pod Save America. No. Is it Pod Save America? Yeah. On Pod Save America about it. To me, it's like a Hillary Clinton moment, when she was like, the flames were licking me as I rushed across the airport. And then Cheryl Atkinson came out, who had been there reporting on this visit that Hillary Clinton was doing for CBS, and showed absolutely nothing happened at the airport. She was totally fine. The drama, it's very image serving. The drama that Gavin Newsom was basically almost burned alive. The governor of California. Take a listen.
We went up to one of the canyons on the fire, sitting there feeling we're a good quarter mile away. I'm not making this up. Video to bear it out. All of a sudden, we see an ember, hits the tree goes on fire, 100 seconds. God is my witness, may have been 90 seconds. The house is in flames. I have embers of flames. They're taking it off my hair, and we're running back into the car. Winds are swirling around. Garbage cans were in the air, and we were getting the hell out of there.
Okay, why is he saying, as God is my witness, and I'm not making this up before he tells the story? Truly, can I see the video? Can I see the embers in your hair? I mean, I've got questions, sir. I don't find you to be a truth teller. Based on a long, long history of your lies. But seriously, who stops? Can you imagine if Ron DeSantis in the middle of responding, not in the middle of responding, in the middle of the hurricane devastating his state, swinging over to talk with the guys at Ruthless about how it affected him? I got super wet. The rain came down, got in my hair, and then my hair got blown too. Not making this up. Hand to God. There's videotape of it. The press would be excoriating him. But Gavin
So even people in the political center and center left are not claiming that California's governor and LA's mayor are distinguishing themselves during this crisis.
Newsom, let's talk about my hair. Did I manage to work my hair into the conversation or not? There's a lot to get through today, and we're thrilled to do it today with Stu Burguiere. He's the host of Stu Does America for Blade.
It set the entire shoreline on fire.
Makes no sense.
This can't possibly be a true story from Gavin Newsom. But that is all Gavin Newsom cares about, is his image. He's immediately gone into this defensive mode where he's trying to blame everybody else as if he had nothing to do with the idea of having water to put out fires, and as if that was a strange concept. Who could have possibly known that a fire could happen? Who could possibly know that the Santa Ana winds would come back? Who could possibly know that we might need water if those two things combine? And that's one of the things when you talk about DeSantis, he wouldn't be interested in that. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about DeSantis nationally is a lot of people have this idea that he is always involved in culture war issues. And he does care about those things, right? He does care about wokeness. He does care about righting those wrongs. And that's good, in my view. But really the reason why he was so popular, this all happened before COVID. He was really popular. Before these culture war issues were widely known, because he took as a priority the idea of competent governance and being able to defend against what is really the main concern of a lot of people in Florida, which is, God forbid, a hurricane comes. What do? There's a massive natural disaster. What do? Are we going to be prepared for it, or is it going to roll out of control like what we're seeing in California? Every single part of Ron DeSantis' job has been to be prepared for those moments. The people of Florida who are residents there, even if they hate his politics on other issues, know he does that stuff well and are willing to put him back in office, whether they agree with him on wokeness or not. Because he's doing the types of things that are baseline requirements of any competent person. He's making sure they are prepared. He's making sure those trucks are lined up before the storm hits. He knows exactly what he's doing. He explains it to the people, and it gets done properly.
Remember he pre-stationed all the electrical workers in the danger areas before the hurricane hit. And this is the same thing. They knew the Santa Ana winds were going to be up to 100 miles an hour before Karen Bass left for Ghana, which now the LA Times is reporting that when she ran for mayor, because she'd been flitting about the world when she'd been a U.S. congresswoman, including over to Africa many times, she promised the citizens of LA she would not take any international trips. She said, don't worry, not only will I be living in Los Angeles, but I will not leave Los Angeles on any international trips if I become mayor. And what did she do? She went to Ghana. Why? It was something super important, something she really needed to get. No, she was a damn boondoggle. Like she had to be there for the inauguration of the leader. Who gives a shit whether we have an LA mayor at the inauguration in Ghana? I mean, it's ridiculous.
So I'm scrolling through the New Yorker, and their story has the headline, "How did the Los Angeles fires get so out of control?" It's an interview with a climate scientist, and it's all about global warming. Nothing about the mechanics of how you reduce the ingredients for creating fires, nothing about an effective response to fire. No, it's all about climate change. I hear Ghana is nice this time of year. Interesting New Yorker. I told you LA has way too much tribalism. It'll make cleanup and rebuilding a nightmare. What's too much tribalism? So it's not tribalism that is the problem. It is whether the tribalism is working in an effective and efficient direction or whether it's operating in a maladaptive direction, right? We all have considerable tendencies towards tribalism, right? Tribalism's not our enemy. Tribalism can make our lives heaven or hell depending on what we do with it, right? We generally prefer people like ourselves. So another New Yorker article here. Does one emotion rule all our ethical judgments? When prehistoric predators abounded, the ability to perceive harm helped our ancestors survive. Some researchers wonder whether it fuels our greatest fights today. So yesterday I shared that Substack essay by Michael Huemer, who a friend calls Substack OnlyFans for intellectuals. And he talked about why is it that women complain that men are jerks and men complain that women are crazy. And he discusses in our evolutionary history, most men did not reproduce. Therefore, men have been incentivized by reality that if they want to reproduce, they have to take chances. And anything that they can do that puts a priority on accomplishment and the development of assets and higher social status, that will make them more likely to reproduce. And so men are often selfish, self-seeking jerks because reality affords them the incentives to behave that way. Then men look at women as crazy because women tend to have much higher levels of fear and anxiety than do men. Because when a woman has sex with you, all right, she could be saddled with the child for the next 20 years, and the man might just skip off. So obviously a woman is going to be experiencing much more fear and anxiety about sex than men. So the traditional way of understanding this type of morality is through moral foundations theory that Jonathan Haidt talks about. That there are 5 core domains of moral intuition that process different types of moral stimuli. There's harm care. How can we reduce harm, increase nurturing, fairness, reciprocity? So how do we reduce cheating and how do we reduce equality? So these are the 2 primary moral foundations for people on the left. People on the right have these 2 moral foundations, but they also add in an additional 3: loyalty to an in-group, hierarchy, authority, respect, and purity and sanctity, keeping it clean. So we've got a new book out by a professor of moral psychology, and it's called Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground by Kurt Gray. And he says that this is our most pressing problem. It's easy to think we have transcended our animal nature because we wear performance fabrics and prompt artificial intelligence to help us with our knowledge work. But all our thoughts and feelings arise from a mind that evolved eons ago. So yes, evolution also affects the mind. Different forms of life evolve under different circumstances and therefore evolve different gifts and different weaknesses, because we have evolved to survive and to spread our seed. We didn't evolve to be happy, but the mind has been affected by evolution. Thus, different groups tend to have different levels of cognitive ability. How could they not? Because they evolved in very different circumstances for millions of years. So you've got your moral philosophers who search for abstract principles of right and wrong, largely based on their intuition. But moral psychologists are much more interested in the empirical matter of how morality really works. So moral philosophers talk about how we should make moral judgments. Moral psychologists examine how we do make moral judgments. So MFT, Moral Foundations Theory, this is what Jonathan Haidt puts out, that we simply have different brain structures. But this theory is being criticized on a wide range of grounds, including that it is unsupported by neuroscience. So Kurt Gray wants to sweep aside moral foundation theory and replace it with theories with moral foundation theory singular. He says our ethical judgments are governed not by a complex of modules, but by one overriding emotion. Right? We have fear written into our genes, so we're hypersensitive to threats of harm. So if you want to know what someone sees as wrong, your best bet is to figure out what they see as harmful. So everybody shares a harm-based moral mind. Harm is the master key of morality. So if we all have the same ethical equipment, if we all have one primary intuition that determines our morality, then why do we have different responses to ethical questions? Well, moral disagreements arise even if we share this harm-based moral mind because we disagree about who is especially vulnerable to victimization. So consider abortion. So for people on the left, the harm suffered by women lacking access to an abortion, and so their fear is primarily about the woman. Conservatives focus on the harm suffered by the fetus. What about immigration? Progressives focus on the suffering of innocents fleeing difficult conditions. Conservatives highlight the victims of people who are in the country illegally. What about trans issues? Liberals emphasize how trans women are vulnerable victims. Conservatives emphasize how trans women are threatening to other women. So as long as you have a perception of harm, there's potential for outrage. Fear and moral indignation are inextricably linked. The safer we become from physical danger, the more hazards we see lurking out there. So millions of years of being hunted by beasts have made us preoccupied with danger. Now that we don't have saber-toothed cats to fear, we fret about elections, we argue in group texts, and over decisions at PTA meetings. I like this. So Outrage was written at a time of extreme political polarization, comes out just before our polarizer-in-chief, Donald J. Trump, is set to be inaugurated. So the book's tantalizing promise is that it will help us find common ground. So if you want to cross moral divides, find common ground, how do you do it? Don't imagine that facts are convincing. People are not convinced by facts. Instead, share a story, an anecdote about someone who is harmed. So Trump, in particular, loves to share harm-based tales, such as the people of Springfield, the immigrants, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets of the people that live there.
Anyway, okay, so she is totally incompetent, and they'd been warned. She'd been warned, her office had been warned, and the citizens of Los Angeles had been warned that these Santa Ana winds were going to be very dangerous and that there was a supremely high risk of fire. Did she pre-position, the electrical workers, the firefighters? Did she bring in tanks and tanks of extra water? Did she make sure the reservoirs were filled? Did anybody under her do that? Did Gavin Newsom? No one did any of that, Stu.
Megyn, she didn't even pre-position herself. She was in Ghana. I mean, she's created a situation where the tragedy is so deep in her own sea that Ghana actually looks pretty good to a lot of the residents. And that is quite the heavy lift for someone in America to pull off. It's shocking. I mean, and we see what happens when people do prepare. We've seen private individuals who've been able to protect their property. It's a very difficult thing to do on a larger basis, of course, but you can do it. This is something that was known. And that's the biggest issue here, is that every explanation for what has occurred points to these politicians. Every single one of them, with the exception of climate change. And the reason why they're all going down this road of climate change as the excuse for what has occurred is because it's the only thing that doesn't point to them. It's the only thing that instead points to some mom in Ohio in her minivan trucking her kids around to soccer practice. It's her fault. It's not my fault. It's their fault. They can point to anyone else. They are in a situation where the only escape route is to blame a 0.9.
All right, let's learn more about harm-based morality. Whoa, that's pretty intense.
I kind of share with you and for those who regularly watch this podcast, discussed was. But along the course of that research in moral foundations theory and discussed and so on, I came across your work in harm-based morality, and I've been fascinated by it. We did a book at the end of our research looking at the emotions of multi-faith engagement. And in my chapter, not only did I discuss moral foundations theory and discussed as a possibility, I also mentioned your work as well. So here, all of that is background. Here we are today. I'd like to begin with a little personal note. How did you personally and professionally get interested in the kind of research that you're doing now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so professionally, I kind of got here by having an advisor who is interested in the problem of other minds. So that's a longstanding philosophical issue, right? Like, you have a mind, you can feel emotions and feel pain, but you don't know anyone else can have experiences, right? It's like Descartes' kind of original insight, right? Like, he knows he's around because, I think therefore I am, right? He's a mind, but there's this kind of like ultimate gap between our mind and those of others, and we're left to guess other people's experience, right? If your spouse says, I love you, how do you know if they mean it, right? That time or ever, for that matter, right? And so it's a really deep problem. And it also relates actually to a lot of theology.
I remember I had this tortured relationship with a woman, and I always felt like the vulnerable one, and she was going off and having lesbian affairs. And then one day, about 9 months into the relationship, when we're having sex, she says for the first time, I love you. And it was like possibly a huge moment, but I'd felt so much contempt from her. I wasn't able to put much value on that brief exclamation during the act of sex. And I was right. It didn't really mean much. Then for other people, it signifies this is someone you can count on.
Theological thing. So propose one grant on discernment, right? The process of discernment as people try to understand God's voice. And it's always filtered through our own psychology, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's ultimately a question of like understanding the mind of God. And so I've got actually a number of things on kind of how people understand the mind of God. But then in terms of my work on bridging divides, I'd say personally, to understand kind of how to kind of better bridge those conversations, not only for, understanding America at large and gridlock Congress, but also for having just better conversations with family members, better Thanksgiving dinners. So that's kind of my personal connection. And that kind of one of my forays, maybe this links up to the kind of things we'll be talking about into harm-based morality and politics and religion, was this op-ed I published in the New York Times in 2015. And it was about evangelical reactions to the likely passage of gay marriage. And at the time, kind of mirroring your approach, right, your initial approach on moral foundations theory, people, academics, even kind of more religious folks were like, look, the reason that many Christians are against the passage of gay marriage is because just of scripture or because of disgust. And my research suggests, well, even in things that seem, quote, harmless or victimless, there's still a kind of powerful presence of harm in our minds, and that kind of motivates our moral judgment. And so we ran a bunch of studies that found that even in ostensibly harmless actions, for instance, entertaining heresy, if you're a Christian, right, that people still see harm in those acts, right, see potential victims, see the suffering of children, see the degrading of society in some ways. And so we published this op-ed in the Times saying that, look, there's a kind of constant presence of victimhood in this opposition to gay marriage, by perceiving like children as being harmed, families as unraveling. And, whether you agree with that or not.
And if your hero system is harmed, you have a heterosexual hero system that marriage is between one man and one woman. You have a heterosexual hero system for the military that is a heterosexual institution. Then the presence of homosexuals in that institution are going to cause you a visceral sense of harm. Your hero system is being trampled on.
The point is that these perceptions on behalf of evangelicals are legitimately held and authentically believed. And so we got a lot of great emails from evangelicals about this, right? It's a pastor down south said, thank you for recognizing my opinions and my perspective. And I'm not just, just inventing this just to piss off liberals on the other hand. Right. And the liberals, for their part, mostly like, I don't believe it, right? But I mean, this is the entire, right? It's hard to speak into divides, right? But the point is that, well, you should believe it, right? And just because you don't see the harm, doesn't mean that other people don't. And what we argued is really there's a connection between seeing something as immoral and seeing it as harmful. And if you see it as immoral, then you see it as harmful, and vice versa. And if you don't, then you don't. But the important point is, like, you have to recognize those other perceptions.
Yeah, I appreciate all that background. Just a little quick follow-up on that. I notice are basically a big part of your work trying to help people identify their own blind spots, as well as what they don't see in the other in terms of
ultimate truth in others, especially, right, to recognize the value in other people's viewpoints. And so we're blinded in many ways about other people and their perspectives. And so my work does try to reveal, one, the kind of truth that other people have that you might not realize, and ways to appreciate that more fully.
Now, your work is in, we've been talking about harm-based morality. For those who've never heard of that concept, can you define it and unpack it for us?
Sure. It's a pretty simple idea, which is that when our moral mind makes judgments, those judgments are ultimately grounded in harm. And so give you an obvious example. So if you see someone abusing their kid, right, or kicking their dog, we think that those actions are harmful and also immoral, right? They're immoral because we see them as harmful. And that's uncontroversial with a lot of things, right? 95% of the laws in America are built to guard against harm, theft, assault, abuse, whatever, right? Fraud, those are all that kind of harm. But the idea of harm-based morality is that kind of like harm-based core of morality, things that we all typically believe are immoral and harmful, that extends more broadly, and that all of our kind of moral judgments are ultimately grounded in harm. And of course, there are other things that matter as well, right? Questions of, you can say theology or family, right? Other values, but even those other values are ultimately kind of further grounded in harm, right? So if scripture says to do something or don't do something, right? It's often understood that's not just like God saying that by fiat, right? But instead God saying that to protect us from harm or guide us in a more kind of beneficial path, right? And so all those things ultimately come together in harm. And the nice thing about it is if we all have it, we can all ultimately make sense of moral differences because, right, we all ultimately have the same kind of common currency, right? You travel to Greece, you need to buy something, right? You can exchange your money, right? We all have an exchange rate. And so the idea is that harm is the kind of like common currency of morality. No matter what values you hold, you can kind of exchange those values through harm.
In preparing for our conversation, I worked my way through various journal articles that you've written over the years and pulled out.
The simplest way of understanding harm is that it's really pairing of two people. So it's not stubbing your toe. It's not, right, hitting your head when you get up in the night, although that, it's harmful, but really it's this kind of interpersonal harm. So one person harming another, a victimizer and a victim is kind of like the psychological model we have in our minds. That's what harm is for morality. And the intuitive part is it's not something we generally have to think about really hard, right? You don't have to look at someone kicking their dog and think, oh, like I wonder if there's a victim here, and I wonder if there's a victimizer, right? You just see the dog yelping and a man like gritting his teeth as he's kicking, and you just think that's harmful and that's immoral. So the intuitive part's important because a lot of research in morality has revealed that our moral judgments are really kind of like almost emotional, right? They are made quickly and without a lot of consideration. And so our perceptions of harm are that way as well. They kind of mirror morality. And then the continuum part, I think, is also important. And this gets into kind of like academic debates. I don't know how much we want to get into, right? But there's this big argument in the field, and it's gone on for a long time about the existence of harmless wrongs, right? And so if there are things that are wrong that people think are harmless, like breaking promises to the dead, for instance, right? People think that that's often wrong, but they say, well,
So we've been suffering a lot of arson in Los Angeles, and we've got the arrest here of an illegal alien.
The fourth incident is an arson incident in which Jose Gerardo Escobar has been charged. Do we have that ready? This is an incident that occurred in Azusa, where Mr. Escobar has been charged with 3 different arson charges. He is looking at 9 years in state prison. This is arson that occurred at Pioneer Park in the city of Azusa. It was investigated by the Azusa Police Department, who acted very effectively and very efficiently in apprehending Mr. Escobar. Mr. Escobar, as well, has been not only has been charged, but he is set for arraignment today. So again, with respect.
Yeah, so we have a new sheriff in town, literally a new district attorney in Los Angeles, who is much more interested in prosecuting crime than the George Soros one. So in news media in the Donald Trump era, Donald Trump, the Republicans are essentially portrayed consistently as the equivalent of arsonists, and progressives and liberals and people on the left are painted as the responsible ones, the natural people to operate government. But these kind of widespread failures, such as in all of America's big cities that are run by Democrats, and now these out-of-control fires in Los Angeles, is causing some people to rethink these assumptions. Here's the Commentary Magazine crew.
Yeah, arose specifically from the need for media criticism and in a matter of weeks he was out, or maybe a matter of days, I don't even remember. He quit the race.
Can we pause on that and make a general point about how the liberal media often summons into being its own worst enemies? Because the causation chain you just laid out suggests that it was Walter Cronkite who gave us Richard Nixon's comeback, and now it's the liberal media the Politico, New York Times, Axios, Axis, and their friends in the Justice Department and in liberal cities all over the country that gave us Trump's incredible comeback. So my lesson to the media is this: shut up.
Yeah.
Just quit. Well, leave it to people who just want to report the facts. You know, go become professors of sociology or something.
And that continued to be politically true with the rise of the 1970s and 1980s, which is when media criticism of a conservative bent really came into being. And almost everything that we publish or talk about has within it, a kind of spine of media criticism. We are here in large measure as a corrective to conventional wisdom. And what is conventional wisdom but a kind of common opinion expressed across news platforms and opinion expression and TV shows on cable channels that completely elide any distinction between opinion and news gathering and the reporting of facts. And that
so the mainstream media has played a significant role in its own loss of status and trust with the general public, just as different groups tend to play a role in the relative status and approval of those groups, right? Depending on how individuals within the groups behave.
A half century of this, there are many consequences, not only the negative or unanticipated consequences of misreporting things as people realize that they're being misreported, but technologically and in terms of various other things, the media that we started reporting on, or, I was going to write a book about 60 Minutes in 1982. Like, that was my first a little something beautiful.
Quince. Topic. I do want to make an editorial suggestion because, retiring the media commentary column, that is a very storied column that's been going on. I collected them in a book that you can get on Kindle. This reservoir that holds 117 million gallons of water that was there to service the Pacific Palisades, the Santa Ynez Reservoir, was not only empty, thus explaining the famous there was no water pressure in the Pacific Palisades after 5 hours. And people were like, well, what do you expect? Hydrants aren't supposed to be there to put out forest fires. They're just supposed to put out individual houses. So what do you expect? Well, maybe you expect 117 million gallons of water in the reservoir that.
All right, the Los Angeles City Attorney here, Haidt Feldstein Soto. That sounds like an excellent name for the new Los Angeles. A proud combination of Latino and Jewish, I would assume.
That pumps the water into the hydrants, and that is not there now. And so that is an unanswerable question. So first we heard that it was offline for a year to make repairs. That turns out it may not have been true. It may have been empty since 2009. So in the world of the Camp Fire of 2017 and the other wildfire of 2018, and the fact that Los Angeles is actually referred to as the Los Angeles Forest in some ecological documents, that you had 170 million gallons of water, a place to put it, going empty for 15 years. I mean, I'm just saying, like, heads are going to roll.
Even if it were true, even if it proves to be true that it was offline because it's under repair, when the first wave of fires happened and they started talking to California officials and Newsom and Pass, and they were sort of saying, well, this is where the hydrants aren't supposed to handle fires like this, and then okay. And I said, this reminds me of the New Orleans officials explaining why the bollards weren't there on New Year's Day morning, and why the terrorists could go drive onto Bourbon Street and mow people down, because there's this sort of like, I said at the time, dog ate my homework, or just buck passing, but what did they say about the bollards? They're under repair. The reservoir is under repair. Like, if it is true, this gets to your incompetence question, this sort of large-scale competency problem in the country. Like, does nothing work? Are we a sort of country under repair, on hold? you know?
Well, look, we started talking last week in very grand and long-term historical terms about how this is sort of the end, 100 years into or 110 years into the progressive era, that what we're seeing here is some kind of final judgment on the progressive era. And I don't want to sort of go into all of but the one central idea.
Is anything going to change in Los Angeles, Luke? Will it all be forgotten in 20 months? Well, we've got a new district attorney. We essentially have a Republican law and order district attorney after having suffered through a George Soros district attorney for 4 years. So that was a dramatic change. We have a new mayor of San Francisco, right? We had the most left-wing mayor kicked out about 4 years ago. Then we had a more moderate mayor appointed, and then the more moderate mayor has just lost in an election in November to a mayor even closer towards the center. We have Californians voting to restore the definition of theft to something much more reasonable instead of insisting that people have to steal over $900 worth of goods before they can be charged with a felony. So Californians have consistently been voting for more law and order over the past 2 elections. So, yes, we're going to see things change. Now, does this automatically mean Karen Bass will lose the next election? No. Does this mean that a Republican will be the next governor of California? No. But there are changes going on in California. And even if it means that they will primarily go on within the Democratic Party, we have California consistently rejecting affirmative action. And now in the past 2 elections, rejecting the most liberal prosecutors, and Californians have voted to restore law and order, to restore criminal deterrence for many kinds of theft. So, yes, some things will change, but it doesn't mean that Republicans will become the majority party in California tomorrow. But you can have substantial change within the governing Democratic structure, because some Democrats are far more interested in law and order than other Democrats.
The idea that dominated progressivism was the idea that government could be made to run more efficiently according to scientific principles, right? That is the root idea. So that if you can say, well, you're portraying human nature in a way it doesn't really exist, or you're expecting, this is technocratic and semi-fascist and all that, it would be like, whatever you want to think about it, if we take experts and we put them in charge of things, they're going to run them more efficiently.
Rational administration.
Rational administration was the term. And now what we see is it's almost exactly the opposite. Progressives it's very easy.
I have a theory.
Okay.
It's because rational administration collided with the movement of the 1960s.
Yeah.
And the New Age radical movement of the 1960s ate up rational administration. It was irrational administration. You saw that in New York in the late 60s, early 70s, and you're seeing it in Chicago today, and you're seeing it in Los Angeles in dealing with these firefighters, where the biggest priority of the Los Angeles and California political establishment is fighting Trump 7 days before he takes office.
Or using diversity as the key principle on whom to hire to do things like put fire.
And looking at Harvard Business Review, they have an article about the benefits of having fewer white male firefighters and the need for greater racial and gender diversity in fire departments. Many fire departments recognize that their lack of diversity is a problem and say that they are committed to increasing racial and gender diversity. And we have various members of the Los Angeles County and Los Angeles City fire departments getting on board with diversity here. In Harvard Business Review, great work, guys.
Out.
And shielding illegal immigrants from ICE, when the person who was subject to a citizen's arrest, when he had a kind of a flamethrower, or propane, torch, the other day was revealed to be an illegal immigrant. That's what happened. The whatever that movement was in the 60s, wherever it germinated from, the universities, of course, but the philosophy behind it confronted it progressivism, merged with it, and then consumed it. And so now we are where we are, where you're talking about a competence issue. Well, it's localized. It's like it depends on who's in charge. I mean, because there's no competence issue in Florida, and just to be bipartisan, there doesn't seem to be a competence issue in Pennsylvania either, which is run by a Democrat, Josh Shapiro, but who seems to know that he needs to hew to the philosophy of rational administration, or at least competence in government, in order to get some of his more.
So I know people who moved to Florida and they simply don't think about crime anymore, right? That's the night and day difference between, on the one hand, Los Angeles, on the other hand, Southern Florida.
Or liberal social priorities across, and not reverse those priorities, in which case you get a lot of new pronouns, but you get bad government and you get a very disappointed and resentful electorate.
There's this sort of, to invoke our old friend Noah Rothman, there's this like sub rosa thing going on right now that speaks just to that, which is the Laken Riley Act that's in front of Congress right now. And that's an example where pushed by red state senators and congresspeople, this idea that actually you need to give some power back to the states when you have a federal government that refuses to actually enforce the law, in this case with border control and whatnot. And look, there are some issues with regard to federalism with the Laken Riley Act, if you look at giving the power of states to sue and how that works. But that is a direct response to the lack of enforcement of existing federal law when it comes to immigration, and what all of these people in all these states have experienced in terms of violence and crime and disorder. And really, the most important thing is the tax of resources for these states. They are spending a lot of money on supporting people who have already broken the law by coming into this country in the first place. And the federal government's response was to shrug its shoulders and say, well, what can we do?
Well, that, I think, aside from the federal government, is where, as I say, this is the death knell for progressivism. Not progressives, not leftist thinking. That's never going to go away, and it will play a major role in the ideological battles that we live through for the rest of our lives and beyond. That's the nature of the woof, the woof and warp of world society. But when your progressive governor, your progressive mayor, your progressive everything throws their hands up and says, well, what do you expect me to do when there's a wildfire? That's the whole point, which is that it would be one thing if you had a worldview that said the interaction of man and nature requires a certain epistemological modesty. There's only so much you can do to control nature or contain it. There's only so much you can do. And, you have to empower people to take care of themselves and their communities and things like that. If you're somebody who says, we're going to do all this stuff top down, and then everything goes wrong. This is also sort of my point about, what would have happened to Facebook had the interpretation of COVID been correct by the authorities rather than incorrect. Different result. There would have been a different result. Its opinions about it would have been different. People would have been more cowed. If you have a progressive saying, I don't know what to do, that's all they have to promise you, is that they know what to do to make the world a better place and to make your day-to-day life
See, I think
better.
What they promise you is emotional satisfaction that you are part of the elect. What's the title
on
of
the right side of history? Yeah.
Yeah. What's the great title of the Thomas Sowell book? The Vision of the Anointed.
Yes.
You were part. Oh, Gavin Newsom, Karen Bass. We're the anointed. We know what's going on, and these kind of Neanderthal Republicans and populist conservatives who live in the San Joaquin Valley and kind of live and farm out there in the interior of California. They're a bunch of idiots. We don't have to deal with them. I think that's the new promise. The old promise was FDR, where government's going to make your lives better. We'll take care of you. The new promise is you affluent professionals living in these extremely kind of gated, whether the gates are physical or material communities. You're right. You're better than better. You know better than the other people. And what's just disturbing? What's disturbing about this fire is the gates, it doesn't respect gates. Nature does not respect gates, right? And so that now we have this huge moment where a lot of liberal celebrities who live in the Pacific Palisades look around and see their entire homes destroyed, and they're saying, hold it, how did I get here? It's going to be, I think, an eye-opening moment for a lot of
neo-conservatizing moment.
And this is actually, it's a perfect example, and I'm glad Matt invoked FDR, because this is exactly what Joe Biden's presidency foundered on. He was supposed to be another sort of FDR-sized figure, but it turns out that after decades and decades of liberal governance and progressive ideas in action in these blue states, it can't work. Even if you have that vision, even if you do really want to make things better, when you try to enact it, it fails utterly. And that, since he's doing his farewell tour this week, it strikes me that we're going to see a lot of this. Again, he's going to return to where he started and sort of try to describe himself as this great political figure on par with FDR. But, you know, Carter has just been laid to rest. He's much more in that.
Okay, let's get back to the roots of harm-based morality.
It's harmless. And so if there are things that are immoral that don't involve harm, then logically speaking, it must be the case that harm can't be the basis for all of morality, right? Because we have a harmless wrong, and so there must be something else. And so to the kind of issue of harmless wrongs, my response is, well, harmless to whom, right? Because if harm's kind of in the eyes of the beholder, then if someone sees it as harmful, then it is harmful to them, right? So back to gay marriage, right? So if you're an evangelical and you see gay marriage as harmful, then it is harmful to you. Right. And that's what I mean by harm is perceived. And as far as the intuitive continuum goes, to say that something's harmless but immoral kind of cuts the rich kind of continuum, right, diversity of harm in two, right? The harms and the not harms, the wrongs and the not wrongs. But in fact, like it proceeds along a gradient, right? So genocide is a wrong, but so is, I don't know, double parking. So is going 20 over the speed limit. Is it as bad as genocide? I don't think so, right? There's clearly a difference there, but it doesn't mean that one is not wrong and one is wrong, right? And so betrayal, but I think you can say it is harmful in the fact that what if everyone lied, right? Or what does that mean for like people who are dying, right? It harms them as they're hoping that their dreams are carried forward and other people, right, don't follow those dreams, right? So you can kind of see it as harmful in a sense, intuitively even if it's not as harmful as something like murder. So I think those are the important parts in my work that I've tried to highlight as we've kind of engaged in these academic.
And this guy is Kurt Gray, moral psychologist, and he was on the Aporia podcast
at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in a few videos. And before you dive into this conversation with Kurt Gray, I strongly encourage foundations theory. So to understand that, I encourage that you watch that video. I think it's called
Well, I wanted to be a geophysicist because my friend's father was a geophysicist and it seemed like an awesome career full of outdoor adventuring. So I majored in geophysics, and then I had an outdoor adventure, decided I no longer wanted to be a geophysicist, switched to psychology, took a year off to go to Australia, and I thought I wanted to do work on heuristics and biases at Carnegie Mellon, which I think is still a really interesting topic, but ended up getting into grad school with Daniel Wegner. And he was at Harvard, and I got a phone call from Dan when I was surfing and picking grapes in Australia, and he said, do you want to come to grad school with me? And that sounded like a good idea. And so I started grad school with Dan. We studied mind perception, we studied morality, and then after graduating from there, I went to University of Maryland for a couple of years, and I've been at UNC for 9 years.
So yeah, I know a lot of white people who've applied to work for the Los Angeles Fire Department, and they have a heck of a time getting anyone to call them back, as opposed if you're some treasured minority group, then you'll immediately get a call back.
My research really kind of started out in the biases in people's judgments. It moved towards a little more philosophical in some sense about like how we make sense of other minds and how we make our moral judgments. And Dan's work, as characterized by Josh Green, and I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about it, is kind of mind on mind, how your mind perceives other minds. And I think that's a nice way of characterizing my research interests too, how your mind sees other people's minds.
Has philosophy played a large role in your intellectual work? Did you read through the greats, as it were? I see you reference, for example, Aristotle and a few others when it comes to the bridge between moral psychology and moral philosophy.
So I wouldn't say that I sat down and deeply grappled with the canon of philosophy.
The key problem, I think you'd agree with that, right? That's the key problem there, that the conflation between this philosophical notion of objective harm somehow crept into psychology, which you seem to argue with Chelsea Shine should be a totally different project.
Agreed, right. So I think often folks who aren't kind of like aren't steeped in science think that what scientists often argue about is the kind of data and the phenomena, and I think that's true sometimes, right? We can disagree about, whether this thing is there or not in the world, but I think probably what arguments are more about, and in some sense more intractable, is really what findings mean, right? So we can all agree that a study shows something, and that something is replicable over time, but I think really figuring out what it means, right? Like there's an operationalization of something, right? We show that people do X or Y in a certain situation, but then you link that to a broader theory. And I think there's a lot of leaps of faith between those levels that I think we need to take more seriously, as I'm sure we'll get into with morality.
Before we get onto that, I would just like more of I'm fascinated, for example, by like this sociology of intellectuals, how people like Jonathan Haidt and how those theories come to be so prominent, right? It seemed to me that the world was crying out for this course correction, as it were, in moral psychology. And obviously Haidt's written about that with Greg Lukianoff recently in The Coddling of the American Mind. But I guess my specific question is, how do you think such a glaring mistake?
So the owner of the Los Angeles Times, Patrick Soon-Shiong, was the primary guest on Mark Halperin's show this morning. Says regrets endorsing
We'll
Karen
accept
Bass.
on blame, right? So at the LA Times, we endorse Karen Bass. I think right now in front, that's a mistake, and we admit that. So I thought it was very important early on for me to come out. And I think we were one of the few to say competence matters. We got maybe 20, 23 million views to show how that was really dear to the heart of most people, whether you're right or left. And it's an interesting thing is that maybe we should think about how we elect people on the basis of, did they actually run a job? Did they actually make a payroll? Do they understand what it is? And rather than having professional politicians whose only job is really to run for office. There's nothing, I'm not trying to be disparaging, but I think we're at the stage now of the nation and the world. And
so he's trying to shift the Times, Los Angeles Times, which overwhelmingly left-wing paper, in a much more centrist direction.
That there needs to be accountability. And I know that during a difficult time like this, it's tough to talk about the politics and the policies, but I think it's hard not to. How do you think, I mean, I've seen more people that tweet and speak openly about the competence and the accountability among public officials in a way that I haven't from certain groups and people that normally wouldn't say certain things about the mayor or the governor. How much are they, in your opinion, to blame for the policies, whether it's things like the brush, the fire department, et cetera, et cetera? Because I feel like some of the, there's only so much you can do during the crisis, but I sort of, at least from out here on the East Coast, have seen more people in the LA community that probably were very supportive of Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass in the past, openly be critical of both of the two. Where is that line? Where is that line right now in the middle of a crisis, and how much are they holding them accountable?
Well, first of all, we'll accept on blame, right? So at the LA Times, we endorse Karen Bass. I'm not trying to be disparaging, but I think we're at the stage now of the nation and the world, and there's many things we'll talk about even in healthcare, that you really need people to understand how it affects a man in the street, how it affects the working type of person. And I think President Trump in this election has understood that, and he's become truly a Republican Party, as you said, has become the Democratic Party in terms of addressing the problems of the man in the street. So competence absolutely matters. And I'm glad that that's been taken up as almost a meme now, that competence matters.
Xiong, from your perspective, what can the federal government do on issues of crime, homelessness, other issues of urban livability that are really local in nature and governance. But nonetheless, I mean, 3 in 10 people in Los Angeles County voted for Trump. And I think a large part of that was dissatisfaction with the status quo. And I'm just curious, what would a new administration be able to do in this regard?
So let me give you again the practical things I try to do with the current administration in California. I toured Gavin Newsom and I toured Karen Bass 3 years ago to a piece of property that sadly I had to inherit called the St. Vincent's Medical Center downtown, the poorest hospital managing the poorest of the poor in LA. What happened was I tried to take over these Daughters of Charities hospitals that were going bankrupt to help the poorest of the poor. And the Attorney General really didn't help us then. He happened to be called Javier Becerra, who's now HHS Secretary. Really didn't really help us in that regard. So those hospitals went bankrupt and I took over that piece of property. That piece of property, with the hospital no longer being a hospital, could serve as a mental health institution for all the homelessness, and not only have mental health care, but also physically break down a wall between 2 hospital rooms with a bathroom, and you write there a massive kitchen, etc. No action, zero action. We spent money putting people into hotels, buying a hotel at $200,000. And so that is what I mean by competence. I don't know the motivation of not doing something at the core root of that. It still stands empty. That piece of property still stands empty. With regard to the federal government, this federal government now can really say, look, we'll come in and help the urban, but why do we need billions of dollars for a bullet train to Las Vegas? Think about that. What are we spending billions of dollars with a bullet train to Las Vegas, that for which no tracks have yet been laid, but we spend hundreds of millions of dollars? I'm so proud of it as a sort of showcase when we have reservoirs that are empty. So this is the craziness of the frustration when and you're right, I've been involved in the community because I love Los Angeles. My kids grew up in Los Angeles. I evacuated this weekend, so I have personal knowledge of what it means. But quietly, I've been working with both local, county, and state government for 10 years. And the level of frustration grows and grows. Mark Ridley Thomas I worked with to try and create Martin Luther Hospital, which we did. But as you could see, there's levels of issues, better way for me to say it, that's involved with some of these officials that is beyond my pay grade. All I can do is come forth with some solutions. And now it gets more critical. Now it was time for me to really, I've just used the X or Twitter now for the first time in any real meaningful way, and come into audiences like this so that we can talk about it, because we really want to do is actually get solutions.
As you think about the rebuilding, and you said that for now it's a mix of private individuals, do you guys want government officials at the table at first? Obviously, at some point, they'll need to be a part of the process. But do you guys want to do this more from the private sector to start?
I think we need to do the private sector, to be honest with you. I don't think, again, I'm not here to disparage whoever's in power right now, but I don't see competence in power right now. And I don't know if really we don't want lip service, I think what we want to do is actually get solutions. So my idea is to bring people together, and what's excited me is that everybody wants to come to the table to help and to help rebuild. So I think we should start initially with this council, and the LA Times will host the council, and really focus on the entire area. And more importantly, we have to focus on the local people, the mental health issue, the health issues. How to make the schools, the kids, where do they go to school? The kids in our schools rely on the luncheon in order to feed them. Otherwise, they go hungry. Think about that.
Walk us.
So these are the kinds of things that I think on a very practical basis we need to sort of figure out. But I'm a little jaded about bringing our local officials into the meeting.
Okay, a little bit more from Kurt Gray, who differs with Jonathan Haidt on the foundations of morality.
Was made. So when we're talking about moral dumbfounding, the conflation of perceptions versus this notion of, well, this is objectively harmless, which I have an issue with anyway. I don't think I'm not sure there is such a thing as consensual incest being objectively harmless anyway, but that's obviously the philosophical project. But how does that even happen? And then, as you say in your summary article, this was something that wasn't even peer reviewed. It just infected the entire field. Was it because it was clever? Like, what's going on here?
Well, I think, I guess there's a couple things I want to make, points I want to make, and I don't think any theory in some sense is a mistake, right? I think any interesting theory with a set of facts that it's tied to, I think, is an advancement in science, right? So more knowledge and more thinking is always better. But some theories run faster than they should, than how long their legs are in some sense, right? And things that push them. And so I think moral foundation theory is one theory that actually gets a lot of things right. And that Haidt's work gets a lot of things right. And I want to say I'm like very indebted to Haidt. He was in the first symposium I ever did and was kind of one of my advisor's best friends. But I think the kind of way to think, one way to think about it is like, look, there's the great man hypothesis of creativity, or great person, really. And so that's like, there's a person who comes up with this idea. And I think scientific ideas often require a person to kind of really capture an idea in an inspiring and intuitive way. And someone like John Haidt is an amazing kind of thinker and writer. But I also think that a lot of the theories that catch on because things that Kuhn says, and when he talks about scientific paradigms, just like fit the time and fit the ideas. So we're actually writing a chapter right now on the kind of like evolution of moral psychology. And you can see that for at Turiel's time, so Elliot Turiel thought that we, especially kids, as they learn in the moral world, distinguish kind of a conventional domain of social norms from a moral domain of things that are universally wrong. And the kind of social trends or intellectual trends at the time are really this idea of like, this morality as philosophers, right? Like we need to pin down and think of like really what's the thing that divides one thing from another, come up with the necessary and sufficient conditions, right? And it should be about reasoning because we're reasoning beings, right? Like humans, if nothing else, are rational. And so that theory made sense at the time with those assumptions. But you can see these trends, and I think Haidt kind of braids them together nicely in some of his work. Like there's the affective revolution of like now it's about emotion. People aren't as rational as we thought, right? Like we don't even know why we make our judgments. So Nisbet and Wilson, so all these trends, right? And so his cross-cultural work shows that like if you go into other places, they moralize things that at least to our Western eye seem not to be immoral, like eating chicken after a father's funeral, right? And so you've got the kind of example, right? We've been talking about like the they are there, the thing that is real, not the thing that we like make sense of, but just the thing, right? So it's wrong for a son to eat chicken after his father's funeral. People don't have intuitive access to their reasoning introspective access to the reasoning, and people are like affective, intuitive beings. And you put those two together and you really get the kind of rational tale, the paper about how we're kind of morality about intuitions, right?
The tail wagging the dog.
Exactly. And it's a very compelling way of arguing it. So I think those things just came together, and I think it's a pendulum that swung away from the kind of rationalist lack of emotion only in the West, right? So it makes a ton of sense. And then the moral foundations argument is really the kind of like next step of that, when you take those ideas and you tie them to a specific understanding of the mind. And that is a kind of modular mind that was popular at the advent of cognitive science. So kind of, in the 80s, things like Fodor, philosophers like Fodor, and importantly was tied to the idea of basic emotion, right? So and basic emotions suggest that there's maybe six emotions, and they each have different circuits, and they're rooted in our evolutionary past. So you take the kind of like 6 things in our evolutionary past that are functional, you take morality is intuitive, those go together, and you get the current theory of moral foundations. And so in some sense, it's not inevitable, but in retrospect, it kind of seems inevitable that these trends would combine to yield a theory, especially in light of liberals and conservatives disagreeing so clearly. So I think, are there many things with the theory that I think are right? Yes. Are there things that I think are quite wrong? Certainly. But I think it captures the kind of understanding of our mind at the time. And I think it takes a long time for paradigms to shift. And I hope we will, and we will soon, hopefully. But the theory makes sense, certainly.
Yeah. So, yeah, I didn't mean to imply that MFT was a mistake. More just like the dumbfounding, the more experimental side seemed to be like obviously the lack of beer.
Okay, Mark Halperin is streaming live.
This morning with the editor, the owner of the Los Angeles Times, Dr. Pat, as I call him, continues to bounce all over social media and the interwebs. People very interested in some of the things he said. Many of you are quite impressed with him. And yes, the answer to your question is we hope to have him back very soon to talk more. Our main topic with him was the fires. Lots still going on the ground. We're waiting at this hour for both law enforcement in Los Angeles to make a statement, as well as for the president and vice president in Washington to get another update. If either of those occur during the program, we may not bring them to you live, but we'll certainly tell you what they said. Gavin Newsom sent around another email, similar to what he's been sending around to his big email lists, telling people that the lies of the opposition were just that, and correcting the record somewhat. Mostly he just pointed out what he said were lies. I think there's still a lot of adjudicating to do there. Here in Washington, we are on the eve of the first of the confirmation hearings for President Trump's nominees. Pete Hegseth is first up tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Remember, when you tune in at 9:30, you're going to get a lot of opening statements, so don't expect to hear Pete Hegseth testifying anytime soon. Those statements could go for a while. There's not been a new investigative piece that is going to derail the nomination. There's some smaller pieces that will come out today, but we're still waiting to see if the Democrats have a so-called mystery witness. We'll be watching that closely.
Okay, not very good sound quality there from Mark Halperin. So back to discussion of how we think morally, how we react, and our fears about harm driving our moral
Goldberg
concerns.
also suggested at the time that it's also kind of about harm, about kind of like reasoning and harm. So we had reasoning and harm. So when things are wrong, or things that are wrong because you reason that they are harmful. And so then Haidt came along and said, well, things are wrong just because you get this gut feeling that it's wrong, that it's bad, right? So if you get a gut feeling for some reason other than it's being harmful, like thinking of having sex with your sister, well, that's still legitimately wrong, even if it's not harmful in a kind of like reasoning sense. And that's where we get to things like moral dumbfounding, right? When I like think it's wrong to have sex with my sister, even though I can't say why it's wrong because it's not harmful. Although, as we'll get to it, people certainly see it as harmful, right? And so moral foundations theory grows off of that and says, well, there's 5 different things in your brain or your mind that give rise to these feelings of badness, and each of those things is like a lock to a key in the environment. And if you see someone do something like kick a dog, that feels bad for harm reasons. And if you see someone have sex with their sister, well, that's wrong for a purity reason. And liberals and conservatives maybe differ on how many locks they have available, or how many light switches or taste buds or whatever analogy that you want to point to that John often uses. So I think it paints a pluralistic view of the moral world. And I think that is really correct, right? There are lots of things in the moral world that we think are wrong, and they're not just about physical.
There's a documentary about Melania Trump on Amazon.
Than you were 8 years ago. I feel I was always me the first time as well. I just feel that people didn't accept me, maybe. They didn't understand me the way maybe they do now. And I didn't have much support. Maybe some people, they see me as just a wife of the president, but I'm standing on my own 2 feet, independent. I have my own thoughts. I have my own yes and no. I don't always agree what my husband is saying or doing, and that's okay.
Are you able to tell him when you disagree?
I gave him my advice, and sometimes he listens, sometimes he doesn't, and that's okay.
She also said in that interview that she will live full-time in the White House after Tuesday, after Monday's swearing in. So we'll see about that.
Okay, bad sound quality there for Halperin. Let's get back to morality.
Violence, right, or emotional harm, right? There's lots of religious things that seem wrong. There's lots of interpersonal things that seem wrong, right? So he kind of broadened the moral domain of the world. But to do that, he also made a step in the moral mind, which I think is a mistake. Right? And I think the step in the mind is to say, well, if there's these differences in the world, then there must be dedicated circuits or mechanisms in the mind that make sense of those differences in the world, right? Like we must have a lock for every kind of key. And so, right, he said that there's 5 different foundations, right? Or 6 or 3 in previous work, right? So there's a number of things that we hold to. And dyadic morality suggests that even if there's richness in the moral world, and pluralism is obviously true, that you can get all those differences with a set of basic ingredients that you combine to give rise to richness. So just like with chemistry, you can take a set of common small building blocks and combine those together to get a richness of elements and compounds and so forth. So too with morality, can we take a basic set of ingredients. And these ingredients aren't atoms, but they're perceptions, right? And those perceptions are of someone who, an agent, someone with intention, causing damage to a vulnerable patient, right? So those two things together form a dyad, an agent and a patient, right? And one harms the other. And that's a template that kind of, you could imagine if you want to go to Kahneman as a kind of heuristic, right? But not a heuristic in a way that's like derogatory or dismissive. It's just a way that the human mind makes sense of morality. All the richness of our moral worlds, we see them through this common template. And almost everything we've examined, in fact, fits this template. So the important point to keep in mind about dialectic morality, right, which argues that perceptions of harm underlie ultimately all of our moral judgments at a cognitive level, right? Not the descriptive level where you see, right, maybe one person kicks another person or one brother has sex with a sister, right? Actions are clearly different and you can categorize those actions differently, as John has, but ultimately in the mind, what drives those understandings of wrongness are perceptions of harm. And so our data show again and again that people judge acts as wrong to the extent that they intuitively and in some sense effectively, your emotions, view those as harmful. So the move we made with dialectic morality is in fact the same move that John made, right? John says, look, morality is intuitive, it's affective, and it's culturally bound. And so he says, well, it can't be about harm because harm is about reasoning. And we just said, well, harm is also those things, right? Harm is intuitive, it's affective, and it's culturally bound. And so now it turns out that
Halperin is streaming live right now. He's got some criticisms of Joe Biden's speech.
Sort of criticism of the speech he gave today as being a failure to cite some of the things that went wrong on his watch. And there's great disagreement amongst the left and the right about what kind of foreign policy president Joe Biden was. Certainly, there are many things that happened on his watch that he continues to not tell the truth about. But as the Biden people will say, compare it to Donald Trump. All right. Finally, the Weiss report. It's the final report of the special counsel who investigated Hunter Biden, both the gun charge case and the tax case. Apparently, that report is 280 pages, and Fox News has it. Supposed to be released later today to the world, maybe even during this program. So we'll let you know what's in there. 280 pages of Hunter Biden. Finally, before
I just got it. I'll send you some stuff.
Okay, thank you. Finally.
Okay, we'll keep an eye on
that. If you have this broader conception of harm, you can make sense of the moral world. And in fact, it's even better because it happens to be true.
A lot of people who will have come to this video or might just click on one of the videos, they'll be aware of Haidt's work. And they'll probably be aware of the moral dumbfounding stuff, and probably Kahneman, System 1, System 2. And I think in the pop psychology consciousness, there's still this idea that, oh, okay, well, emotion comes first, and then we craft on this post hoc justification, which obviously it does work at one level of analysis. But what your work shows is that the perception of harm is also intuitive. Can you just talk a bit about how you measured that experimentally?
Sure. So so just to provide some background for folks who don't know about moral dumbfounding, right? So what John and his colleagues did was he presented people with an example.
Okay, Halperin's talking about the fires in LA and politics.
Criticism of how the LA officials are doing and the California officials are doing is warranted or a good idea, whatever it is. So let's start bringing in two of our guests. Would be Rob Stutzman, who is an expert on California.
I went to high school with Rob Stutzman. We went to Placer High School. We served on the college newspaper together. We were friends. We rode the bus together.
I believe still a resident of California, if I'm not mistaken. Rob will confirm that for us. And along with Rob Stutzman is Kristen Davis. Both are Republican strategists, and we couldn't be more delighted to have them both with us. So, Kristen, welcome in. Thank you for joining. First of all, do you know where Rob Stutzman lives? Any idea? You know Rob? Did you know each other? You don't know each other. Well, Rob, you should know. We're going to do some 6 degrees of separation. Rob, how well do you know Karl Rove, who Kristen used to work with? You know
Really well.
Pretty well. All right. So there you got Karl in common.
There we go. 7
So yeah, Rob put on about 100 pounds since high school.
degrees.
I know it only take usually if you go to Karl or like Reince Priebus, you're gonna hit pay dirt. Rob, do you still live in California?
I do. I'm still in California. I'm in Sacramento.
Sacramento. So you're not that far from where Gavin Newsom works, but far away from where he's spending his time. How would you, if you were making could you make a positive case for how Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass are handling this, or is that an impossible thing for you to do?
No, it's not impossible. The state emergency response mechanisms, CAL FIRE specifically, are very good because we.
So he's exactly the guy I knew in high school. Right, this is exactly the same bloke. Just very polite, a good Christian, conservative.
We have a lot of these types of events. If we give the governor credit for something, they pre-positioned a lot of assets into Southern California because they knew the forecast for these high winds, these Santa Ana wind event, was going to happen. So I think that's something he should get credit for. It also, though, is the damning evidence for Mayor Bass, because this certainly wasn't an unforeseen possibility to have this type of disaster. Everyone was planning for the possibility.
Rob, if you were lecturing at a political science course, George Washington University or someplace that has such things, what would you say is the number one lesson for a public official out of this disaster?
You have one job, which is to be present and lead when your city or state or nation may need it. And you cannot abandon post. That's always job one. And it leaves an indelible mark that's really hard to recover from, I think.
Kristen, do you look at what's happening now as something that's fair game for Donald Trump and other Republicans to criticize, or should people just be focused more on being supportive of the people addressing this?
Well, I think you could do both. So, you obviously, there are a ton of organizations that are helping pull together resources to help the families in California that have been affected. And
right, so there are rebels. Rob Stutzman was not a rebel. Rob Stutzman was someone who colored within the lines. He followed protocol, right? He was a responsible, upstanding student and citizen, and that there were rebellious people like me who never did play the game quite as smoothly as people like Rob.
I think it's absolutely the first move is to go and promote those organizations, but it's absolutely fair game to then critique what the leaders in California are doing. It didn't stop Democrats from doing it during the hurricanes in Florida. I think Governor DeSantis the other night when he spoke up and defended Trump. So
Stutzman's very much a never Trumper.
Same question was asked was spot on. I mean, there really is a double standard where have these Republican states and Republican governors handling things. Democrats criticize them, nothing really happens, and now you have a Democrat state. And I wouldn't even say that.
So I know a lot of reporters, and some of them would tease Rob Stutzman that he used to be friends with me. And probably not his favorite thing to experience.
The criticisms have been unfair or too much, just basically stating the facts. And you had some Democrats kind of balk and say it was too far. But I think it's absolutely fair game. There is a balance to obviously remember that we're talking about human tragedy here and lives have been affected. And so you can't lose that. And I don't think anyone necessarily has. I think both the President Trump and Republicans as well as Democrats have been highlighting that part. But, from the outside looking in, it appears that Newsom and Bass and leaders in California have shown us exactly what not to do, particularly when you see other governors across the country, like Governor DeSantis, Governor Abbott, these other, Republican governors who have dealt with natural disasters in a very efficient manner. It just is night and day in how the different leaders handle these situations.
You both know that there is no Republican Party in California. We no disrespect the people who currently staff the operation, but Kristen's too young. Rob and I know that Pete Wilson was governor of California. I don't catch Schwarzenegger because I was an Orthodox buddy. If you two were sitting in Republican Party headquarters and you were co-executive directors of the California Republican Party,
so I think Rob was 2 years behind me. So in my junior year, I was the news editor of my high school paper, and Rob, I think, was a freshman and in the journalism class. And second semester, he joined the newspaper. My senior year, I was the editor-in-chief, and Rob Stutzman was the sports editor. And then after I left, Stutzman became the editor-in-chief of the Hillman Messenger.
Go ahead and talk amongst yourselves as you would to say, what could the California Republican Party be doing now to use this as an opportunity? It's not exploiting it for political gain. It's saying, hey, look, the voters of at least part of the state say democratic governance has let us down. You see these celebrities on Twitter saying it. So talk as if...
So Stutzman played a role in the Arnold Schwarzenegger campaign, and he's very much in the polite Christian never Trumper crowd.
If you were in a meeting, what kind of things would you be thinking about doing to try to give the voters who have disregarded the Republican option for a long time there an option? Go.
Kristen, I'll defer to you first.
Okay, sure. Again, being, if you're in the state on the front lines of this, for lack of a better term, there are a number of things that Republicans can do to be the leaders of action. So there are mayors in the state. There are local Republican officials, especially, the further south and north that you go. Pull those together and have them in the community, handing out supplies, just make them visible, because there are so many right now visuals of Newsom running away on the phone and not necessarily being as present and hands-on in the situation. put the Republican leaders in the state in positions to show that the Republican Party is the party to jump into whatever action they can. I don't think right now is the moment to kind of, lay out, here are the 5, drastic mistakes that Newsom made. That's going to come. That time is going to come probably when, once the fires have stopped burning and some of the immediate tragedy has been handled. But right now, there's a lot that Republicans in the state can do to just be present and be that party that cares. I mean, one of the biggest things that voters want in their leader is to know that they care about them. Democrats aren't really doing that in California right now from the outside looking in.
Do people really care that the politician cares about them, or are people primarily concerned, does the politician deliver certain level of competence?
And so Republicans really can fill that void by putting, there are a lot of good local Republican officials in the state that can step up and, ship down to where the fires are to really be present in the community. And
so when I was going to high school with Stutzman, so it was 1982, 83, no, it was 83, 84. So it was Ronald Reagan peak. Morning in America was the ethos. And most of our teachers were liberal, but Eric Scholzke, he was the editor-in-chief of the Hillman Messenger in my junior year when I was news editor, and he went on to be a spokesman for a conservative Republican congressman, then got a PhD in politics from UC Berkeley, and now Eric teaches politics at BYU, last I saw. But Eric Scholzke, year above me, then myself, and then Rob Stutzman, we were the 3 conservatives, the 3 amigo conservatives on the Hillman Messenger.
Then that will help the case later on to say Newsom wasn't there, Democrats weren't there, we were, here's how we could be there in the future.
So I agree with all of that. And I think there's also a policy opportunity, and Republican legislators are voicing this, and this is on the heels of an election in California where Trump did outperform his previous numbers by about 6 points. Interior counties did go red that have been blue for a long time. And voters in every county approved the criminal justice measure over the objection and opposition of Governor Newsom, like 69% to 31%. So there's already a sense that things have gone a little too far in the left direction in California.
Yeah, as Kip says, I went rogue, I went dirty, right? We all went to this journalism program at St. Mary's College in the San Francisco Bay Area for a week. Then I led a bunch of people, not Stutzman, to the Tenderloin, and we went to the dirty movie shows. But not Stutzman. He always had a level head. He was always Christian, both in his public demeanor, his private demeanor. He didn't go dirty like I did.
And there are policy questions that I think that can be raised here. I mean, look, this fire is 90% about a wind event. However, if we're gonna acknowledge climate change in California, why don't we have infrastructure to defend us against it instead of just trying to do programs to try to inhibit it? Let's do both. So there's real policy opportunity to writ large, I think, especially around infrastructure and water infrastructure specifically, for Republicans to make some pretty substantive cases, but also I think have a very tangible political effect as well. It's a permission structure for these rich libs on the coast to say, you know what, it's gone too far. We need Republicans to fix this, just like voters in states like Massachusetts or New Jersey and other places in the Northeast will do from time to time with their governor's mansions.
Let me play devil's advocate, because I'm surprised. I think if you two basically never had a meal with either of you where you didn't bring brass knuckles, which is to say, I think you both are very aggressive. I'm surprised that you're not advocating. Now's the time. Like the California Republican Party has not done well lately. This is a time when I don't remember ever hearing such focused, on-point criticism of liberal governance in Southern California as we're seeing right now. So what's the argument against having a press conference and saying, with whoever, national Republicans maybe, to say, here are the 5 things that Republicans would do with conservative governing principles that would deal with the situation now and protect us from happening again? What's the argument against being aggressive like that?
The argument against it is...
So I remember when I was in high school, I wanted to write stories about how things really operated, right, behind the scenes, all the cheating that would go on in the athletic department, conning the system to try to better enable winning by various athletic departments, and how the school was oriented around athletics, and then the other people that I was working with were much more play within the system, and were much more polite, were much less subversive, and our personality and psychological and social tendencies were just so obvious, right? Back there in high school. And we haven't changed that much since then.
They're finding human remains, and that Southern California is still on fire. And by the end of tonight, there could be other parts of it that are on fire. So I still think you're in the midst of an ongoing crisis. And what you're describing, Mark, may exactly be something that should be done, that I probably would advocate, as long as it's clear in what they want to do. But that's probably 7 to 14 days from now, once the fires are out.
Right. I guess I got a personality that loves digging in the dirt, even if it would cost me everything. I wanted to dig up the dirt. And Eric and Rob, they were much more smart. They were much more broad-minded, and they did not enjoy hanging out in the filth as much as I did.
And we truly have exhaled because we've come out the other side of this event.
Yeah, no, I want to be clear. I think that Republicans in states should annihilate Democrats on this. This is not just going to be a one press conference type of thing. There's a whole campaign and party rebuild to come off of the failures here.
Because we've
but
come out the
almost
other
more
side
important than a hit is the timing of the hit. And so to do so now, I think could backfire potentially on Republicans in the state. To Rob's point, you really have to take into account just the human life tragedy that's happening. And I think being there and being the bigger person by being a hand for the people that are suffering, ultimately, will make your punch a little bit harder when it's time to make it.
And Gavin, don't give Gavin an opportunity to accuse Republicans of politicizing. He's doing himself in. The more Californians see Gavin.
So in 2023, there was a Los Angeles Times article about Stutzman. There was a column called "A Democratic and Republican Battled for Congress. They Became Unlikely Friends." So Rob Stutzman's a Republican political consultant, and this Los Angeles Times article captured the bloke that I knew. Rob was always polite. He was always civil. He played hard, but he played by the rules. I always beat him one-on-one in basketball. He valued our institutions. He valued friendship. He had all the traits that you would expect for success in life and in politics. He never crossed the line into the socially unacceptable. He didn't even come close. He was very difficult guy to dislike, right? He was a fair dinkum Christian, but he carried his religiosity lightly. I don't recall anybody who disliked Rob Stutzman. And even in high school, I was often operating outside the lines of decency. I was the school's bookie, right? I led a trip of my mates through San Francisco's Tenderloin district into porn theaters. I would say shocking things. I was unpredictable except for my attention seeking. I was challenging my teachers. Some of them said, "Oh, you're the most challenging student I ever had." And my life fell apart in my early 20s from chronic fatigue syndrome. Well, Rob just kept building. He built a good life. He went step by step. He got married. He had kids. He just kept building on a good reputation. He was always solid. He was predictable. He was stable. And around him, I would calm down a bit. So I wouldn't be surprised if Rob Stutzman never lost a friend. Like I've lost, feels like over a dozen. Right? I always put a priority on self-expression over connection. Rob would take other people's feelings into account. Right? He preferred real friendships to my more bizarre attention seeking. Many people in my life have been disappointed that I would put more value on my pursuit of truth than on loyalty to my friends. So according to Chris Mooney, conservatives are less willing to pick a fight with their friends, less likely to issue a corrective when they need to issue one to their friends, less motivated to step out of rank and to call out bogus assertions. So Rob always played the game as established by the powers that be. I tended to rebel. Rob went on to great success within the system, and he was appalled by Donald Trump. So I've largely played outside the system. And I was on board with my fellow rebel Donald Trump from July 2015. And Rob Stutzman is no longer quite as socially conservative as he once was. So in 2000, he ran a campaign to ban same-sex marriage. He has since renounced that position. So this is an article by Mark Barabak about a friendship between a Democratic congressman and Rob Stutzman. So Congressman's Army bearer, and there's Stutz. So both are self-described institutionalists, people who fundamentally believe in our government and in our political system, want to see them function better. They're described here as mature and pragmatic and less performative, not so much bombast and schoolyard antics. We're all for the same type of success for the state, the county, the local government, says Stutzman. If a willingness to recognize that and to seek common ground makes us an odd couple, referring to his friendship with this Democratic congressman, I think that's a sad commentary on today.
On the news every night, gesticulating and talking in non-sound bites, talking about the president, who's obviously running space in his head, President Trump. I don't get in the way of that at the moment, is some of my political assessment. It's pretty damning. This happened during COVID a bit, where he was on every day doing the briefings. At some point, people don't want to see you, especially if all you're doing is complaining instead of, to Kristen's point, actually look like you're doing something productive in the midst of the crisis.
Dan Turntine, you know him from the morning meeting, but I brought him in because, Dan, I want to ask you about something that I thought about today, and Kristen and Rob, you guys may have a point of view on this too. I've not seen much Bass Newsom alliance. I've rarely seen them on camera together. They're both a little bit under siege, and not for exactly the same thing, but being found wanting. Dan, how do you appraise, and I don't know much about their relationship prior to the fires, but how do you appraise the two of them? Is it every man and woman for themselves here, or should they be doing more of a united thing?
Yeah, I think they should be doing more united stuff. And I wouldn't just limit it to Newsom and Bass. I mean, the delegation has not been rallying around their leaders here. You have county officials or city officials that have blamed one another for it. And I think as both guests were just saying, in a crisis, you want to look like you're in command, you're strong, you're calm, you're cool. And both of them look the complete opposite. I mean, at times they've been frozen on camera. At times they haven't wanted to answer, people who have come up to them. There's, a lot of finger pointing at, I want to know answers, and this group needs to look into it. And I think, as you were just saying, for Republicans, there's that line between appropriate criticism, but then trying to solve the problem. And I think for the Democratic Party, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, you have Nancy Pelosi kind of aging out here. She historically, ruled that delegation with an iron fist, kept very close tabs on everything happening in the state.
So Stutzman reminds me of my former UCLA professor, Russell Roberts. And Russell Roberts was a big influence on me in converting to Orthodox Judaism. And when I would talk to Russell after class, he essentially laid out back in 1989 everything that he'd go on to do with his life. He laid out the three maiden books that he wanted to write. Right. So some people move step by step towards the things that they want. And Stutzman, Russell Roberts, right, people who follow the rules tend to get the rewards.
And you just kind of feel a little bit like the party's coming apart or not coming together on this front.
All right, let's bring in Charity. Charity Jennings, welcome in. Thank you for joining. Let us unmute yourself and then tell folks what.
There's the immediate get the fires out and get people taken care of, but then, rebuilding houses, rebuilding neighborhoods.
Come on, guys. I'm trying to run a high quality show here. What the hell?
Charity or just me?
Yes.
Charity, we've lost your audio.
I'm trying to run a high quality show, guys.
The mic came unplugged.
What the hell?
And getting permissions to actually build. Both the governor and mayor talking about the future, but that's notoriously a long and expensive process. So what does that look like from a policy perspective?
So in the olden days, I think it would have looked horrendous. But there's three things going on that I think could well cause them to go faster and to really engage in the cutting of the bluest of red tape. Number one, the example of Governor Shapiro in fixing the highway. That really resonated for a lot of Democrats. And Governor Newsom, as a competitive governor, watches very closely what other prominent governors do. So I wouldn't be surprised to see them try to follow that example. Two, because of social media, and the sort of ethos of transparency that we have now, there's nowhere to run and hide on this. And then lastly, there's a lot of really rich people who want to build faster, and they can afford lawyers and they can afford all sorts of things, to lobbyists and everything else. So I think you're going to see it will be faster than the norm. Whether it will be fast enough or faster than would be in a different state, I don't know, but it will be faster than it would have been. Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. The governor issued an executive order yesterday suspending our Environmental Quality Act, which we call CEQA in California, which is really a code word for don't build anything. So we usually only suspend it to build sports stadiums, but he is suspending it. He's also suspending additional regulations that go with the coastal zone. There's a whole commission here in California called the Coastal Commission that have jurisdiction, but that's all statutory, and he's the executive authority under an emergency like this is pretty broad. So it won't be Florida, it won't be Texas, but I agree with Mark. It'll be about as fast as you can clear it in that blue red tape, as he said.
Kristen?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head by mentioning Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania. That really spoke, I think, broader than Pennsylvania when he was able to fix the highway that quickly. It also resonated in state. I think that's why his numbers are really started to go on the upswing as they did. And frankly, Governor Shapiro kind of looked like a Republican governor when he did that fast. And so I think, Governor Newsom, if he wants to compete in that 2028 game, which he's always mentioned, is going to need to, this is his test. And right now, I think he's failing miserably at it. He has a very, very short window to turn it around. And I don't even mean, build a new apartment building or a new house tomorrow. Just show up as a leader. We haven't seen the leadership presence from him, the, confidence to know that someone, I think Charity or someone here mentioned it, that he's in charge, that people in California, if I were a California resident right now, I would be very, very nervous that no one is managing the crisis around us, because he hasn't shown up in that fashion. And so he needs to do something to take the leadership mantle. That's the first test. And then that will, we'll see how fast everything else goes. But he's losing that window to, even if he were to build very quickly, his first, response in these first few days has been so erratic and, shaken without confidence that I think he's going to have a hard time showing success, as he builds later on.
Dan.
Yeah, I totally agree with Kristen. I mean, he's ambitious and he's got a very narrow window here to get back on offense and try to just project strength and command, and then turn to the execution of policy. I think there is more opportunity on that front because people don't expect their house to be rebuilt in 24 hours. And I think given that kind of liberal governance is a little bit on defense kind of nationwide right now, there really is this opportunity for him. But first and foremost, he has got to look like he is in charge and more like Haley Barbour and less like, who was it, Governor Blanco, who just looked like a deer in headlights during Katrina and never recovered.
Charity, thank you so much. How'd you find out about Tulip?
It was recommended on YouTube.
Longtime observer of Washington. And he pointed out two things that John Thune has done that have not gotten a ton of attention. And I want to know what you all think of it, of this thought. One is he came out against eliminating the filibuster. And he also came out and said the party shouldn't overrule the parliamentarian if the parliamentarian rules against him, saying that was akin to getting rid of the filibuster. As you know, Donald Trump in the first term tried to get rid of the filibuster, and Senator McConnell stood strong and said no. Democrats made it a litmus test for the party to say get rid of the filibuster. So they kind of opened the door to it, if not for Fetterman or for
Sinema and
Sinema Manchin, they would have done it. Thank you. So I'm wondering what you all think of what that says about John Thune, and do you agree with this lobbyist that it's a big deal? Kristen.
This is pretty consistent with how Senator Thune has approached his new position as the majority leader. Just go back to, before Christmas, we were talking about recess appointments, and we haven't really seen any of that happen, any of those confirmations. I think it is a testament to the institution of the Senate. Again, so much different than the U.S. House. The senators really do value their role as being an independent body to, follow their rules and their procedures. And I think Thune has been true to that. So I think it's consistent with how he's approached the job. I think it's how he will approach the job. That doesn't mean it's going to be a hindrance to the Trump agenda. I think it's actually going to help it get more support across the aisle by protecting that institutional procedure and approach to the U.S. Senate that so many of those senators really value, and many of them of whom won't be up for re-election for another 6 to 8 years. So they don't necessarily have to rush and do very dramatic procedural moves. So I think it's very consistent with how he's been and how he will be in the position.
Before Dan and Rob responds, I want to bring the lobbyist I had lunch with on and have him explain why he thinks this is such a big deal. Just happens to be my dad, Morton Halperin, who was a long time world lobbyist in Washington, who I did have lunch with. Dad, why do you think what Thune did is such a big deal?
Because it's contrary to what Donald Trump said he wanted. It reflected that there still is within the Senate and the Republican side people who care about the institution and care about the role the institution plays in keeping our society together. What I would like to see is the Democrats responding to that in an affirmative way, and a group of Democrats come out and say now that they would never vote to end the filibuster or to change the Byrd rule, so that we can put that behind us as a first step towards trying to get more bipartisan policies out of the Senate and then ultimately out of the Congress as a whole.
Rob, I'd love you to just say what you think this says about Thune, but also, do you think he checked with Mar-a-Lago before he did that? Donald Trump, as pointed out, really wanted this, and yet I didn't hear any reaction from Trump after Thune said what he said.
I think well, Thune's this way because he's an institutionalist, right? So, but I believe Cornyn would have protected it as well, and Trump really didn't have an alternative to assault this kind of institutional protection in the Senate. So I agree. I agree with Morton. It's significant because of what it signals, I think, about still Senate independence. And my guess is there were conversations where they've made it clear to Trump, we're gonna protect this, and it's not worth making a public row over because there aren't votes in there for it. My guess is that, pick your, whether Tom Cotton or someone like that probably was also, conveying that to Mar-a-Lago about the reality of this situation. Now, what will be interesting will be, of course, if we hit some type of loggerhead in the Senate, whether it's the upcoming tax bill or something else. And of course, Trump may then resort to wanting to decide to get rid of the filibuster again.
Dan, on my father's long road from head of students for Eisenhower at Columbia University in college to working for the Open Society Institute, he's maintained his idealism. Is he crazy to think that any Democrats would come out and say, yes, we should preserve the filibuster at this point? And if so, who would they be?
Boy, I feel bad disagreeing with Mr. Halperin, but I can't see it. And I actually think that they were smart to be quiet, because I think if this became the Democrats and Thune, it would raise the backs up of MAGA and everybody else. And I think that it's noticeable that not just that it didn't get much coverage, but you didn't hear the Mike Lees and others kind of, saying this is an outrage and we have to do this, or a Josh Hawley, people who historically have been pretty comfortable, Rick Scott, kind of sticking it to the leader. They were quiet. The kind of MAGA influencer world didn't really seem to get their back up. And I think Democrats were pretty smart to be quiet. I think in terms of going forward, I don't think Democrats believe the filibuster should remain. I think if you poll the caucus, that would be where most of them would come down. And obviously Manchin and Sinema are now both gone. But, it's easy to say it. It's another thing to actually pull the trigger and end it. So, this will kind of remain back and forth here as long as it's a 50-50 country.
All right. Some breaking news I want to get all of you to comment on. You mentioned earlier that the special counsel's report on Hunter Biden by Mr. Weiss has been released. And the most notable thing that we've seen so far, please put up the graphic, is his criticism not of Hunter Biden, but of President Biden. And I'll read you a bit of this as soon as it comes up. I'm going to not read it from there. I'm going to read it from what I have. He says, other presidents have pardoned family members, but in doing so, none have taken the opportunity to malign the public servants at the Department of Justice based solely on false accusations. These baseless accusations have no merit, and repeating them threatens the integrity of the justice system as a whole. Dr. Halperin, what do you think of a special counsel rendering such judgments in a final report? Is that appropriate? Is it fact-based? What do you think?
I think the tradition of final reports, which is relatively new, is a fundamental mistake and goes against the basic principles of our criminal justice system. That is, the government either charges you with a crime, which it then has to prove in court, or it stays silent. And I think this is part of the dangerous process of politicizing the judicial system, and I think should be put into an end.
Yeah, I don't know. I totally agree with you. I don't understand these reports. They're just like a final shot with no counter witnesses. That the accused get to read them in advance and raise objections, but they seem not to care about their objections. And it's an opportunity to just hit the piñata on the way out the door. Kristen, what do you think of the charge, and to what extent, now that we're a little bit of ways from the pardon itself, what do you think role this will play in how people think of Joe Biden for the foreseeable future?
Well, there was I think it was last week, Gallup released a poll showing that most Americans think that President Biden's presidency will be viewed as almost the worst in the last, 70 years. I think Nixon was the only one who was viewed less favorably. And yes, his record and the economy, and we go through all the mistakes, the Afghanistan withdrawal and the pardon of Hunter Biden, all these things added together. The way that Biden is exiting office, I don't believe is fair to probably the younger Biden who first entered office however many years ago. I think he's really displaying a very self-centered, almost bitterness as he departs, which I think is really going to impact how Americans view him later on. Now, history is always a little bit more favorable to presidents as time goes on.
So I remember 20 years ago, a City Journal out of Manhattan was really favorably disposed towards bloggers, and now they have an excellent essay up. LA leaders cannot hide behind the media anymore. Social media has enabled residents to learn about the gross negligence that contributed to the current devastation. For days now, the wildfires ravaging Los Angeles have left behind scenes that can only be described as apocalyptic, like something out of Dante's Inferno. These haunting, powerful images, once the province of print and broadcast media, now circulate freely on social media platforms like X. In past emergencies, if you couldn't find out something in the newspaper or on TV, you had to seek it out yourself. Today, news and images spread across the globe in an instant thanks to citizens documenting disasters in real time. In neighborhoods across LA, streets now resemble macabre automotive graveyards with hundreds of vehicles abandoned by fleeing residents and later bulldozed by fire officials to clear pathways for emergency services. Equestrian owners walk alongside their distressed horses to lead them to safety, their silhouettes framed by whirling embers like sparks from a colossal forge. People evacuate hospital patients on foot, pushing them in their wheelchairs in the dark of night with only the light of emergency vehicles as a guide. Smoldering and charred rubble is all that remains of once thriving urban and commercial centers. Single-family neighborhoods are being completely flattened and turned to ash. Los Angeles feels like ancient Rome set ablaze. City's leaders are either conspicuously absent or trying to look important on camera as the city burns. Leading Democrats quickly blame the catastrophe on climate change, but thanks to social media, residents learn daily of the acts of gross negligence that contributed to the devastation. The fire, which ignited Tuesday, January 7th, grew to catastrophic proportions by evening. Former mayoral candidate Rick Caruso, whose daughter lost her home in Pacific Palisades, was among the first to report the city fire hydrants were dry, leaving firefighters without water and powerless to combat the spreading inferno. Media pundits initially tried to dismiss his claims, but videos posted by ex-users showed firefighters discussing the dry hydrants, silencing the critics. As with every natural disaster, state and local politicians have lined up to audition for their next roles, mugging for the cameras and putting on their best tough yet compassionate act. Most disaster briefings have become little more than opportunities for these individuals to preen for the public while they thank and praise one another. But to the shock of the elected elites and their complacent bureaucrats, something is different this time. Citizens, armed with instantaneous and continually updated information, are angry, and they're speaking out against the incompetence of their leaders. Past disasters, people had to rely on what the mainstream media told them, not anymore. And thank God for Elon Musk sending Starlink to LA so that vast areas of LA that would otherwise not have cell phone service, at least firefighters and reporters can have cell phone service thanks to Elon Musk and Starlink. The revolution is not being televised, it is streaming live on X. As LA burns, Angelinos have realized that we are the media. That's devastating news for our city's incompetent elected officials. Several important stories have gone viral. So Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, who promised that she would not leave the country, well, she came under fire for being in Ghana on a taxpayer-funded junket when the city burned. She fielded hostile questions for what seemed like the first time in her communist political career. She had a reporter asking her, do you owe citizens an apology for being absent while their homes burned? Do you regret slashing the fire department's budget by millions? Have you nothing to say today? Karen Bass froze, then walked away in silence. Deputy Mayor for Public Safety Brian Williams was placed on leave last month, was being investigated by the FBI for making a bomb threat at LA City Hall. And despite Karen Bass's attempts to downplay the budget cuts to the fire department and deny their severity, a whistleblower leaked an internal memo indicating that just 1 week before the wildfires erupted, the mayor had insisted on an additional $49 million reduction, which would have resulted in the closure of 16 fire stations. LA Fire Department Chief Kristen Crowley has spoken out against the funding cuts, placing the blame squarely on Mayor Bass. Janice Quinones, the chief executive of the Los Angeles Department of Water, who makes $750,000 a year, bumbled through an explanation of why fire hydrants have run dry. Days later, it was revealed that a 117 million gallon water storage reservoir in the Palisades had sat empty for years pending repairs. Quinones said in an interview, it's important to me right now that we do things with an equity lens and with a social justice lens, making sure that we right the wrongs we've done in the past. A distraught woman who just lost her home angrily confronted California Governor Gavin Newsom. He tried to duck the woman's questions, telling her that he was literally talking to the president right now. When the woman asked if she could hear the call, Newsom was forced to admit on camera that he wasn't literally talking to the president because he did not have cell service. Like a wildfire, the news hits keep growing and spreading. An online petition demanding the immediate resignation of Karen Bass has received 115,000 verified signatures. The once solid electoral walls of this deep blue state may soon catch fire too. Establishment leaders in the mainstream media are not going to save us. Real change happens in the real world, never more so than in LA. Pick up your phone and be part of it.
However, I don't think we've seen a departing president, they're all different. The circumstances are all different. But the way that Biden is leaving, with the shot at the Justice Department, with the pardon of Hunter Biden, with saying he would have beaten Trump, there are so many things that he, almost unforced errors that he's making as he departs, that are really going to tarnish his legacy, at least in the immediate. Maybe when we're all long gone, people will look at it, 100 years from now a little bit differently. But at least in the foreseeable future, the way that he's departing and the manner in which he's leaving, I don't think is doing him any favors in terms of how Americans will view him or his time in office.
The sad thing about that City Journal piece is nowhere does she mention the threat of misinformation. Guys, the misinformation that spreads like a wildfire on social media platforms like X, that's a much bigger threat than real fires.
Rob.
Yeah, this underscores the pardon's one thing, but it underscores how terrible it was for him to blame DOJ for politicizing the prosecution. He should have just pardoned Hunter instead of a.
So Stutzman, never Trump Republican, hasn't voted for Trump any of these three elections. So I presume he either voted for Biden or declined to vote against Biden.
Father loves my son. So I agree with your comment about the reports, but I think this is a fair shot, and it adds to the criticism that Kristen's talking about. The problem for Biden is going to be the vanity that's on display is just breathtaking. I could have won if I'd stayed in the race. And Biden is going to be a president that I think it's fair to say, without trying to be unkind, is not going to have a lot of time after office to be a former president. We just saw the wonderful.
Wait, as a Christian, how on earth can Stutzman renounce his opposition to same-sex marriage? Right, there's just no basis in any remotely traditional understanding of Christianity or Judaism that enables one to be A-OK with same-sex marriage.
Wonderful celebration of a wonderful American life this week in Jimmy Carter. Well, that largely had to do with the gentleman's citizen life after office. And Biden's he doesn't have that runway. And what people are going to remember.
40 reaching out to the Zoomer audience with the captions. Yeah, I noticed that Zoomers tend to watch Netflix and TV with the captions on. Sometimes I do it when I can't fully, clearly understand the audio on a movie or TV.
By is pretty much, I think, what you see now. And no, it's not going to, I don't think it ages well at all. The presidents that get more popular in retrospect, again, I just think have a little bit more of that time to be around the hoop a bit as former presidents than Biden's going to have.
Dan, I want to ask you your instincts or knowledge about Weiss, who, for the vast majority of the top of the investigation, seemed to be going out of his way to make things easy for Hunter Biden. He certainly wasn't super aggressive. He let the statute of limitations lapse. He arranged a plea deal that, had it gone through, and he wanted it to go through, would have allowed Hunter Biden to not serve any time. And then once the plea deal was ripped up by the judge, he became extraordinarily aggressive. And
so the number one problem in America right now is crime, both for Republicans because they are inevitably tougher on crime than Democrats. And what's going on in New York is horrific. 14-year-old boy in New York City was stabbed to death while walking to school by a violent criminal repeat offender who was arrested for a different stabbing just 2 months ago. He's also a suspect in another stabbing from last Sunday. So why was he out on the streets, not behind bars? Because you have Democrats running New York City. If this was a city run by Republicans, right, that stabber would have been behind bars.
Now in this final report, at least it pertains to Joe Biden, super aggressive. Any clue as to what happened to Mr. Weiss to go from one mode to the other just in that one?
I like Kimberly Strassel. So let's find out what Kimberly Strassel has to say here.
Democrats in California have tried to implement their climate change policies all over the country. They have not been based in logic or in results to help the environment. They've been based in ideology. And now you're seeing the results of leftist ideology and these policies completely failing at catastrophic levels. And not just in terms of the fire prevention. While they were, banning plastic straws and mandating that people drive electric vehicles that they didn't want, they weren't doing basic fire management that people in other states had been doing, like, hiring goats in some places to come and clean up the brush in areas. It's actually not that difficult to do this kind of management. But instead, they were more focused on taking 50% of people's tax dollars and using it for pet projects that have no impact on actually preventing catastrophic natural disasters. And so hopefully they've learned some lessons here as these problems with the winds continue. This is not a new thing in California, and we've seen it before. This happened in Maui as well. Some of these same issues.
It's massive, Kimberly. I mean, Congress is going to have to deal with it in some way, shape, or form while they're still trying to cut. I tried to talk about that with the both members, Democrat and Republican. It's going to be tough to do.
Well, it's going to be tough to do, but I do like the idea, and you are hearing Congress people talk about this now, is that, look, this is a natural disaster, but it's one that everyone knew was coming. I mean, there were warnings about it. We have these fires year after year, and despite the fact that we do not have a California political establishment that takes into consideration anything that Katie was just mentioning about what you need to do, not just in terms of fire mitigation, but for getting ready from an infrastructure perspective to deal with the fires when they come. And that's in terms of reservoirs, the pipes. I mean, all of this is crumbling. They haven't been fixed in some places for 60 years. They were not ready for this moment that nonetheless people knew they were coming. And so when Congress has this discussion, there is going to have to probably be some help, but it should be tied to some changes in policy, because federal taxpayers should not just be throwing more money at a problem that nobody has any intention of fixing in a way that can really be fixed.
Meantime, President.
Okay, and here's an analysis that I think also has insight for why people vote the way they do. So why do men stay committed once the wife loses interest in sex? So one speculation is that natural selection has bred men to become addicted to powerful sources of pleasure so that they continue to seek and expect satisfaction even as it dwindles. Another option is that gullible people who begin to think they've been duped double down on their commitment. They believe ever more fervently that that the evidence is wrong, and so they engage in a dissonance reduction effect. So when a man starts to realize his wife is not acting like the sex goddess he naively and gullibly envisioned, this may result in an intensification of his belief and an expectation that eventually she may perhaps become that sex goddess again. He may remain fixated on how wonderful it was before, and he fails to realize that things have changed, consistent with many patterns in which people do not realize that their knowledge is flawed or inadequate.
One moment.
I don't. I really don't know. I just think that, you know, for Joe Biden to go out this way, I mean, I agree with everyone, with everything that has just been said. And I think I go back to when he came into office, one of his big things was he wanted to restore the independence of the Justice Department. And he has defended it for, 3 years and 11 months. He defended it. He defended it from the attacks by Trump and Republicans. And to just flip on a switch in one statement and say everything was political against my son, and this was basically a witch hunt, is just, it looks ridiculous. And I agree with everything everyone has said.
Okay, stand by. David Griffiths, come on in. Tell folks who don't know where you are, what's on your mind.
All right. Well, I'm in Tennessee. Moved from the Chicago area about 5-6 years ago. Anyway, big thing for me, you talk about the filibuster, and that actually is something that I'm looking at myself, kind of going, Democrats pushed on that this whole time, and it looks like the Republicans are at least taking a stance that, in my belief, yes, we need to maintain that filibuster. It definitely protects from us doing these swings back and forth that we see, and so I would hate to see that go away. And ultimately, I think one of the reasons why Democrats feel the way they do maybe is related to the fact that they're probably never going to get back to 60 senators again, at least not in the next 25 years anyway. And the Republicans, I'll say, have an outside side chance of maybe getting to that point, and so they probably have a little. They look at it as an opportunity. But that being said, I guess where I would love to, the question I'd ask the group is, 2028 is coming. That's one thing, and Democrats have a shot of winning in 2028 from a presidency perspective. But when 32 comes and the redrawing of the maps for the Electoral College, it's going to change dramatically. They're talking California could lose up to 5 seats, New York 3. It's like 11, 12 seats. What does that, what kind of impact do you see, that having on, I guess, Democrats, and how they have to, look at that map going, not 4 years from now, but 8 years from now?
I'll start. It's obviously in the short term, in a static way, it's very good for Republicans. It doesn't replace a full mega state, but it can replace a small state. I think what I look at is what states that, besides the 7 that were in play this time, could be legit in play next time. The states Republicans have been pushing on since really the Bush campaign in 2000, Minnesota and Virginia after it went the other way after Bush, New Mexico. These states are not truly in play, except in an extraordinary case like a very weak Joe Biden. Now, if somebody like the governor of Virginia was a Republican nominee, certainly besides Virginia, he might put Colorado in play potentially. But in just generically, you don't see states. And then the states that Democrats have tried to compete in, like Florida, which right now it's gone for a good long while. Texas, people keep talking about Texas, but you don't see that. So I'll be curious, Kristen, you first. Do you see states in play besides those electoral college shifts? Do you see states in play in 28 that weren't in play this time?
Yes and no for both sides, right? So I could see us making a real run for Minnesota. I do think Virginia and New Mexico are always going to be a little just out of reach for us right now, probably in 28. But I also think Democrats have a walk in the wilderness to do right now. They need to redefine themselves as a party and reconnect with the average American. If they're able to do that by 2028 and put up a decent nominee, then they could potentially put states like Kansas in play, which has been on the cusp of being purple and blue. Georgia could be more, dark purple. But yeah, I think that you're looking at, to your point on the House side, California and New York will lose their power. I think Florida will probably, have a stronger Republican contingency. You see Florida and Ohio and Indiana are red states. And you look just back to 2020 and it was not that way. I mean, a state like Iowa, is that always going to be red or are we going to shift more blue? So I think there are so many factors that I would be very foolish to stand here today and say, these are the states that are going to be swing states in 2028, because there are so many factors that are going to be at play. And the top one for me is going to be, which direction does the Democrat Party go? Now, if the Democrat Party keeps going the way that the 8% of their base is pulling them, then I think we will be competing in Colorado and New York and New Jersey, and maybe we'll go for Massachusetts. We're going to have a very fun map in 2028 if that's the way the Democrat Party is going to go. But if they can get their act together and, with all due respect to my Democrat friends on here, if they can, put up a good nominee and put up a good campaign, then I think we're going to look at, some of the same states, but potentially could look at states like Kansas and New Mexico and Minnesota, and it'll be a totally new map. So it really just kind of depends on which direction, first where the Democrat Party goes, and then whether or not our coalition holds post-Trump. Because again, Trump is a once-in-a-generation leader, and no one, no matter how good they are, will be able to copy and paste what he's built. And so who will be able to take their own voice and their own brand and continue the, working class connection that Trump so successfully has tapped into? They won't be able to just do it what he says. They will have to be able to communicate it in their own voice. And that will be so key in 28, because the person that is just going to want to copy what he says, as we saw in 2022, it doesn't work, or else we would have had a Senator Herschel Walker and Senator Oz and all those around the country. And so both parties will have, a test in 28, how our party is able to adapt and hopefully grow what Trump has built, and whether Democrats can, redefine themselves.
Dan, again, obviously the nominees will tell a lot of the detail, but as David pointed out, long-term Democrats are on the short end of the electoral college shifts. What states do you think your party can reasonably compete for in the short?
Okay, let's listen to Laura Ingraham here.
As water pressure fell dangerously low and sometimes even ran out of water altogether. Even Gavin Newsom himself has a lot of questions. He's doing an investigation. And at the same time, we know that diversity often trumped merit in hiring and promotions, and it still does in California. We also know that millions could have been directed toward better emergency services that were instead spent on illegals that California happily welcomes in. And of course, we know that that helped fuel homelessness, which is skyrocketing still in California, and at points has also posed its own fire risk, with people lighting fires outside for cooking and so forth. And of course, we know that will strain the school system, which now ranks a pathetic 34th in the nation, despite the highest taxes in the nation for the people who live there. We also know that there's an exodus of businesses already from California, and that the wealthy are leaving, and the middle class, they're picking up and leaving as well from the state. It's simply too expensive. So although California is so incredibly beautiful, it has so much promise, so much still brainpower, such rich history, courtesy of horrid liberal policies, California has, in a metaphoric sense, been burning for decades.
So the Los Angeles City Fire Department has 9 DEI positions, all right, all with a minimum $300,000 salary with benefits. And where's that photo of this one? Okay, here we go. All right, this lady here, this fat lady here, she makes $400,000 salary a year just for pushing diversity. with the Los Angeles Fire Department. So the LAFD is run by a lesbian mafia.
Businesses already from California, and that the wealthy are leaving, and the middle class, they're picking up and leaving as well from the state. It's simply too expensive. So although California is so incredibly beautiful, it has so much promise, so much still brainpower, such rich history, courtesy of horrid liberal policies, California has, in a metaphoric sense, been burning for decades. Now, given this, why should we listen to the same people who helped cause the education disaster, the fiscal disaster, the immigration and homelessness and drug disaster, and who didn't get the state ready soon enough to battle the current disaster? Why should we listen to any of them about how to fix California going forward, when the flames are finally put out? We know this already. We know it's going to take hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild L.A. County. And Newsom, he has bold plans.
We're already organizing a Marshall Plan. We already have a team looking and reimagining LA 2.0. We're already talking to civic leaders. We're starting to organize how we can put together a collection of individuals on philanthropy for recovery, how we can organize the region, how we can galvanize the community with folks that love this community to really develop a mindset so that at scale, we're dealing with the scope of this tragedy and responding to it at scale with efficiency.
So much hand gestures. All right, over the weekend, Newsom tried to stem the public's anxiety and anger by signing an executive order to streamline permitting for the rebuilding of lost or damaged property, even nixing some environmental regulations that, of course, hampered builders in California for years now. Well, we're actually encouraged by that, but the proof will be in the pudding. The main concern of so many who've lost their homes is having the ability to rebuild their single-family homes, again, given the high costs and given the fact that in some cases, like I believe State Farm was one of them, insurance companies began to pull out of California. That's also because of the California regulations not letting rates go up. But in California, environmentalist radicals have succeeded in making the state among the most expensive for construction costs in the United States. Because the liberal dream that's been called sustainable housing, which really means high-density housing for most people, meaning goodbye single-family homes, hello to high-density housing. Can put out the fires a lot easier in high-density housing. Everyone's in one place. But the old Brady Bunch view of California, a family house with a backyard, maybe a few cars, a neighborhood, I think that's what most Americans want. But I'm telling you tonight, despite what we're hearing from Gavin Newsom, and we look forward to seeing his plans, do not be surprised if you start hearing more politicians and more activists clamoring for smarter, safer housing options, which, again, on the surface, it sounds great, right? Who doesn't want smarter and safer homes? But remember, they're going to blame everything on climate change, meaning they can't really do anything except change the way you live. They can't govern differently. They can change the way you live. And always remember this. The rules that they put in place won't apply to them. They never do. Remember Gavin Newsom's French Laundry dinner during COVID? That kind of told the whole story. So as Californians are being chased off beaches, they were prevented from going to restaurants. He was enjoying a gourmet dinner out with friends in the Napa Valley.
Okay, by popular demand, it is time that we revisit the eucalyptus question, the tragedy of California wildfires with USC professor William
Humans
Deverell.
tend to run from mid to late spring through the fall, and we've got some now that are a little late, but the worrisome feature of them on a drought-ridden landscape is the winds that start well to the east of us in the Great Basin of Utah and the Intermountain West. And as they move west, those winds drop in elevation and get warmer and drier. And then they find their way west through the various canyons and arroyos and other landscape features of, in our case, Southern California, where their warmth and their dryness is going to increase the likelihood of fire ignition.
I mean, we're in January now, which is not typical Santa Ana season. Is this now a 12-month-a-year phenomenon?
Well, certainly fires are. In my lifetime, we referred to fire season, and now it doesn't make sense to refer to fire season here, largely across the American West, in fact. That's a 12-month season. And so we are dealing with climate in flux. Some things are known, some things are not known, but it's unfortunate to the tragic level that our empirical understanding is now in part based on the results of the last 48, 72 hours.
My own rudimentary understanding of how to preemptively control fires, big problem in the Canadian West, is you create fire breaks.
Yeah.
Breaks in the landscape so that fire can't just jump from tree to tree uninterrupted. Is it the case that when winds get to a certain speed, those things are useless? My understanding is that this fire actually jumped over divided highways.
Oh, no doubt. And you all have had this tragic experience. We have watched.
This is a key talking point in the mainstream media coverage of these fires, that it was just inevitable. The wind was blowing too hard. The fires were just too intense. There was nothing that firefighters or Democratic politicians could have done.
As your southern neighbor, the fires in the Canadian West over the last several years that have been so devastating. And so we're all in this together, as it were. But once the fires are up in the tree canopies and embers are allowed to be picked up by the winds we just had, which were ferocious, fires can jump through the activity of an ember that's maybe an inch big. So it's the fire on the land, if there's no wind, could be more likely controlled. But once fire climbs up into the tree canopies through heat and wind and whatever, those things can absolutely move and jump to the level of miles.
My boss actually tweeted something about eucalyptus trees. My understanding is there are certain trees that actually there's an evolutionary mechanism, an advantage to occasional fires, and that they can propagate through fire. And eucalyptus trees, as I understand, contain all this oil. Is there any kind of invasive species aspect here where there's just different kinds of fire-prone trees that have been planted?
Sure. Yeah, sure. And the eucalypts were brought here. And so there are trees that the germination patterns require intense heat. But that just reminds us that fire is a common experience. It's normal. It's just we now have abnormal fire. Yes, there is a problem of invasive species that can be particularly fire prone. The mitigation for fire can cover anything from cultural and human behavior to landscape care, to try to address climate change, to be more aware, to perhaps stop building up into what we call the urban wildland interface. So there's all kinds of mechanisms and tools to try to mitigate what we now have so much evidence of is a new fire regime in the American West, which over the last several decades, each successive large catastrophic fire becomes the...
Okay, finally touched on the eucalyptus question. Let's get back to moral psychology with Professor Kurt Gray.
Example of someone having sex with their sibling, and it's specifically designed to be harmless, right? So they have fun, it's consensual, there's a condom, a birth control pill, they never do it again, they don't have kids, they never tell anyone, it's wonderful, right? So it's carefully designed. And then people say, well, it's wrong, and John asks why, and they say, well, because it's, the first thing they say, I want to say, is that it's harmful, right? And he says, well, I just told you it's totally harmless. And so in his mind, and I think the minds of many moral psychologists, the fact that scenario is designed by the psychologist and the experimenter to be harmless is evidence enough that it truly is harmless. And this is a kind of funny rhetorical move, because the whole premise of moral foundations theory is based on anthropology, right? And so Rick Schrader's work, groundbreaking, was about like, well, if you want to know about morality, you should just ask people, right? Be embedded in their knowledge systems and their, as Turiel would say, informational assumptions. And so if you take their moral judgments at face value and they say, well, this is wrong, right? Anthropologists say, well, then you do think it is wrong. And if they say immediately that it's also harmful, then why shouldn't we, as anthropologically inclined social psychologists, also take that at face value, right? Now there's this kind of, in some sense, like a prejudice against harm, and I think because it's been associated with reason for so long. But you could just as easily say that it's not legitimately immoral, right? But of course, now we say, well, it must be legitimately immoral. We're appreciating different cultures. But I should say to that, you can also legitimately appreciate other people's harm. And so to your question of how do you measure this harm? How do you show it's intuitive? Well, you can show it's intuitive by people argue very quickly it's about harm, right? That's a kind of system one hallmark, like it happens rapidly.
Okay, remember Lindy Lee, former Democratic fundraiser who wasn't so happy with the Kamala Harris campaign?
Some of the folks who led Kamala Harris's presidential campaign are now working, I dare say, pretty hard to deflect the blame for her historic loss. We want to bring in DNC National Finance Committee member Lindy Lee, The Hill national political reporter Julia Manchester, and Reason senior editor Robbie Suave. There's so much good sound here. I want to begin with you, Lindy. I've really enjoyed listening to your candor on this topic. I think people do want to know what happens now. Are we looking at 4 years of wilderness? Where do they stand now, and what can they learn from the loss in 2024?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a fan of yours, so I really appreciate being here, and thank you for saying that. I was on a call with Kamala Harris today, and there was no introspection, no postmortem as to how we blew through $2 billion in just 100 days. And to be perfectly clear, it wasn't just $1 billion through the campaign, it was another billion through the super PAC, and it was spent, millions were spent on greedy consultants, celebrities, private jets, ice cream. $450,000 is spent on the sphere, putting your face on a giant ball. I mean, how is that supposed to be helpful? And then $500,000, we recently learned, was given to Al Sharpton right before he interviewed her. So all of these things, we have to be accountable for that. And there's been no sense of responsibility, no accountability. I feel like all these consultants are just going to fail upwards time and time again and just move on to the next campaign as though this disaster didn't unfold.
Well, that is some strong information right there. You know, Robbie, I talked about this before, and I don't mind telling you, when I saw some of the math, it was like, are you kidding me? It wasn't just Al Sharpton's group. They're paying Oprah's people $2 million. As Lindy was saying, I mean, money was full.
Okay, nothing really added there. My mistake. All right, back to moral psychology.
Another hallmark is that it's hard to inhibit it. So if John says, well, it's not harmful, I just told you it isn't. And they say, well, it still seems harmful to me, right? I mean, like, that's pretty system one, right? Like, you just can't help but feel it. There's some work by Jean Dessetti that shows that judgments of harm in the brain happen in like 200 to 300 milliseconds, even faster than moral judgments. And we have some work that shows that moral judgments happen maybe 100 milliseconds after judgments of harm, which is exactly what you'd expect if harm feeds into morality. We also have some work on cognitive load, which is a classic kind of inhibition of system two, right? Making people so they can't reason. And so we give people a number of scenarios that are designed by to be harmless. A funny story about these scenarios, right? So we took John's scenarios initially, like having a kitten rub itself on your genitals or watching animals copulate on TV, examples that were designed to be harmless, and we used these in a manuscript. And then, John reviewed this paper, made some really excellent points, but a funny point that he made was that, well, these are too obviously harmful. Right, which is funny because the field is based off of these things that were ostensibly harmless, right? But it seems that now they actually do involve some sort of harm. And so we had to develop new things that were just, one thing about being a moral psychologist, you get to like think of all these depraved things. And so we had things like someone masturbating to a picture of their dead sibling, right? So like clearly out there. And it turns out that people still think that those things have victims. They're wrong and they're harmful. And the interesting thing is, if you make people answer quickly or put them under cognitive load, they think that those things are even more likely to have victims, right? So it turns out that post hoc rationalization doesn't create victims. In fact, it suppresses victims, because you know explicitly that these things can't really be harmful because they're designed not to be harmful. But your first gut reaction is that they are harmful. I've got a funny story about this, actually. I was at a conference talking to a philosopher about dyadic morality versus, moral dumbfounding. So, I argue that things are intuitively harmful and that drives moral judgments. And he was saying, well, the harm is just, people don't actually see this harm, they just make it up. And he was talking about, this philosopher was talking about his mother. And his mother was incensed that this one museum had removed this statue, even though the person who gave a lot of money to the museum required that the statue not be moved, right? So the wishes of the dead, honoring those, is seen as something in philosophy as kind of like an important moral thing, but is essentially harmless, right? Because the person's dead, what do they care? And so he keeps on saying, look, this is harmless and my mom thinks it's wrong. Well, I said, you're not your mom, like, do you think it's wrong? And he said, no. And I said, well, your mom thinks it's wrong. And I asked him if he thought it was harmful, and he said no, right? So philosopher says not wrong, not harmful. Mom knows it's wrong. Does mom think it's harmful? And so the philosopher said, of course my mom thinks it's harmless because it is harmless. So I said, let's call your mom. So we get on the phone, we're drinking, right? It's like 10 at night or whatever, mom's still up. And so he phones his mom. He says, Mom, she says, oh, thanks for calling. We haven't talked about it. He says, Mom, I don't have time. I don't have time for this conversation right now, but you need to answer this question. You remember that museum where they removed the statue? I remember. What do you think about that? I think it's outrageous. It's wrong. He says, okay, Mom, is moving the statue wrong? Is moving the statue harmful? And she says, you bet. And he said, what? It's not harmful. And she says, it is harmful. It harms his memory. It harms his family who gave the money. It harms future museum people. It harms everyone who subsequently gives money ever. And so, right, here's a case where she legitimately and intuitively perceived it as harmful, and that was tied to the moral judgment. So that's our argument, right? Perceptions of harm drive moral judgments.
And then your next question is, what accounts for moral pluralism, which obviously seems to be where moral foundations theory is on strong ground. And
okay, get a little bit more here from Mark Halperin's show.
Or the next iteration of the Republican nominee focuses on the working class. Look, some Democrats believe that Ohio has become like Missouri and Iowa too. They've drifted away. They're older. They're whiter. That you could see Pennsylvania and potentially Wisconsin going kind of the same route, where if the coalition is kind of Latino and black and young whites and kind of these upper class liberals, that there is more of a future in North Carolina and Georgia and Arizona. But look, we started going backwards with those groups, and so the party has to decide. Are we going to try to, win back the industrial Midwest? But as the person who asked the question said, it's not just that New York and California are going to lose seats. I think a lot of the North, Massachusetts is probably going to lose a seat, and Pennsylvania is probably going to lose a seat. I mean, it's all the things we're seeing in life that, it's good to own housing in Texas and Florida these days. And so, in 2032, just winning back the blue wall states is not sufficient, and just winning back, Nevada would not be sufficient. So we as a party have to decide where are we going to try to play. And if the answer is the Sun Belt, then I think, you are looking at Georgia and North.
Okay, question about the future of Kamala Harris. I just don't see what future she has in politics. She's clearly not cut out to make tough decisions. She's a terrible manager of people. I hope she keeps running for political office because from my perspective, she's such a disaster.
North Carolina, Texas is a state. I mean, I know it's been talked about forever, but if you're going to try to go through Arizona and Nevada, another state I'd watch is Utah that doesn't seem to love Trump. They just elected a senator that, was pretty broke with Trump in a few places. So I think the party first has to decide what is that coalition of the future look like and what groups are we going to try to target.
Rob Stutzman, which will happen first? A Democrat wins Iowa or a Republican wins California in the presidency?
Until this week, I might have said the Democrat in Iowa, but I would still go Democrat in Iowa, I think. The other thing I would add, I agree with everything that was said, is Texas, though, is interesting to me for the Democrats longer term, maybe not by 28, but you're talking about this allocation of electoral votes happening in 32, as the guest pointed out. I'll be curious where Texas really goes over that, that's more than a half decade away. The population growth isn't all going to be red country people seeking relief from blue states. So that'd be the one where I think of those states that are going to gain, like Illinois is another one that's going to lose, right? So of the states that are going to gain substantial electoral votes, I still think Texas would be the interesting thing to watch.
Okay. Dean, come on in. Tell folks where you are, what's on your mind after you unmute.
I should be unmuted.
Yes, sir, you are.
Good afternoon. Good evening, everyone. First, Mr. Halperin, you look pretty darn good to have a 60-year-old son.
Thank you. Amen.
I'm from Ohio. I guess I'm one of those older, whiter folks from Ohio. Go Bucks. We hope to have a good showing in a couple of weeks. I'm fascinated by this. This has just been such a learning experience, this platform for me. And to Rob and Kristen, I'm in the last election, as I recall, from, I think, reporting here and other places, the ad that was most successful for President-elect Trump was the issue, she's for they, them, and I'm fighting for you. This seems to be and I would even say that's a fringe issue, really not affecting many people. I guess first to Rob, and I'm very interested for Kristen, because Kristen said Rob's party is looking to redefine and reconnect. Well, I lean to the right, so Kristen, I'm looking to stay connected and keep everything in place. How do you folks work on dealing with the fringe issues or the fringe of your parties to ensure that you stay in the mainstream and can win elections long term? Because obviously you're looking at things long term. I'm interested in that.
Well, it's a constant battle. To be clear, I'm a Republican. I'm just not a Trump Republican. I know I have never voted for the president-elect. So.
I got you. Okay. Yeah.
Well, no, don't be sorry. It's fine. We look. This has been in California. This has been one of the reasons Republicans have led themselves into some obsolescence, although they've made gains in the last election, is because they were too defined by fringe issues.
And he thinks that immigration restriction, my old friend Rob Stutzman thinks immigration restriction's a fringe issue. He was appalled when Donald Trump said, why do we have to take in people from shithole countries? So he's very much on board with continued huge levels of immigration and refugee intake.
And we're not offering, solutions.
He was appalled by Trump's Muslim ban.
They didn't have their eye on the ball, so to speak, which is what I think the proxy of the transgender ad during the presidential campaign was about. It's not an issue that affects most people's lives, but it
is. It is, because if you are appalled by that, it is affecting your life, right? If you are sickened by the notion of using taxpayer funds to take care of transgender surgery, that affects you, right? Your feelings, your hero system, what you view as right and wrong, is appalled by Kamala Harris and Democrats saying, yeah, we need to fund taxpayer transgender surgeries for illegals and for criminals, right? That hits you like a punch in the face, like a punch in the stomach. And this idea, oh, it doesn't affect you. He is completely disconnected from his Christianity or any sense of reality. Human beings always have a hero system, and a violation of your hero system violates you, right? You feel like you're being harmed when you witness this threat to everything that you regard as sacred. So it's a cliche that he is offering of the conventional wisdom that is false.
It indicated that this was what was important to the agenda of the Democrat nominee, were issues like this. And those aren't issues that have anything to do with fixing the life of most American voters. So that was the power of that ad, I think, and that issue. So both parties, the incentive...
No, that wasn't the power of the ad, that it showed Kamala Harris's priorities. The power of the ad is that it showed how the Democratic Party is going to outrage your sense of what is decent. The power of the ad was that it showed the Democratic Party is pissing on everything that created your coherent understanding of life. And when the Democratic Party urinates on your understanding of differences between men and women, right, they're urinating on you, and people viscerally respond to that.
The structure right now for the Democrats is obviously to abandon a lot of that. We'll see if they're able to do that and still navigate the coalition politics of their primaries. But I think this will be a real challenge to Republicans to keep their eye on the ball. And what's clear to me is that Trump has his eye on that ball. He more or less became pro-choice during this election. So I think he has good instincts on a lot of these issues.
Okay, what a disgusting thing to say. Trump didn't become pro-choice during this election. He recognized that running on a national abortion ban or promoting the abortion issue was an absolute disaster for Republicans. Donald Trump did more on the abortion issue than any Republican ever, but Rob Stutzman won't give him credit. If Donald Trump went out and cured cancer tomorrow, Stutzman would find a way to criticize him for it. Donald Trump created a U.S. Supreme Court that overturned terrible, terrible Supreme Court ruling Roe versus Wade, and he returned the issue to the states. Right, quite a distinction between what Donald Trump did and what Stutzman just called him as essentially pro-choice.
And knows when to pull back from the brink when it's becoming too fringy. And then, he's strong enough in his base that any clamoring from the base isn't going to matter. We'll see this play out when he doesn't deport every illegal in the country.
No, that's not what we're going to see play out when he doesn't deport. Nobody thinks he's going to deport every single illegal in the country. But for every one that you deport, another 100, another 1,000 are going to leave voluntarily. That's why it's important to deport a few. It sets a righteous cycle going where for every one that you illegal alien that you deport, right, 100, 1,000, then choose to deport. They self-deport.
And everyone, we call them fringe issues, but they can fit into a broader topic, right? So if you look,
what's fringe to Rob Stutzman is at the core of me. I don't want a U.S. military that celebrates homosexuals joining the U.S. military. I have a heterosexual hero system for the U.S. military. I don't believe in same-sex marriage. I think it's an abomination. It disgusts me. Now, am I going to make that proclamation everywhere I go in life? No, I keep my views to myself, but I do have a particular perspective on life that is largely informed by my Orthodox Judaism. And if Rob Stutzman is anywhere near in touch with his Christianity as he claims, then he too would be appalled by same-sex marriage rather than making peace with it because it's no longer a winning issue for Republicans.
We'll just use Virginia in 21. We talked about schools a lot. Well, in Loudoun County, it was boys and girls bathrooms and inappropriate reading material. In, Southwest, South Side Virginia, it was critical race theory. In Richmond, it was school choice. And so there are different degrees of these issues that, whether you saw it even with this one issue, this transgender issue, but there was that ad about pronouns, but then there was a whole other campaign that talked about men and girls sports. That's a totally different group of people. Same general topic, but a totally different group of people. So it just takes a lot of work to know who you're talking to and where they fall on that spectrum of that issue to make sure that you relate to them. And again, to Rob's point, I agree to not take your eye off the ball, because at the end of the day, even if your biggest issue is a quote unquote fringe issue, you still don't want to pay, $9 for eggs, and you still want to be able to send your kids to a good school. So there are issues that bring us together. We call them kitchen table, issues. And as long as you're succeeding.
If you don't want more communists in the State Department, you don't want more communists teaching your kids, I'm sure Rob Stutzman would call that a fringe issue. To me, that's a commonsensical issue.
On those, then you can kind of find where your voters fall on the spectrum of all these other issues.
Thank you. Dean, thank you for joining. Really appreciate it. Please come back often. Hey, Dad, which party do you think is better on classic civil liberties issues now?
I'm sorry, who's that, sir?
That's to you.
Okay, let's skip that, see if squeeze a little bit more from the Emporium magazine discussion here regarding moral foundations.
The academics in that background would say that dyadic morality is being overly parsimonious.
Right. It's true so far, right? Dyadic morality seems to be really a theory of cognition, whereas moral foundations theory seems to be more of a theory of descriptive differences. But in some sense, it only seems true, right? Because what moral foundations does is make...
Yeah, that's key. So the liberal bias is that we cognitively decide morality rather than it is just an instinctual response in us from primarily our genetics, our imprinting, and our social cues.
Makes this link from that there are differences in the world to there must be differences in the mind, right? So what seems to be, I think, a head start is actually in some sense maybe not quite the way we want to go. And so how dyadic morality makes sense of pluralism is by suggesting that there are differences in things like assumptions of vulnerability is one thing we're working on now. So one example is the environment. So conservatives generally don't see the environment as being vulnerable to harm as much as liberals do. And it turns out that liberals are much more likely to moralize environmental polluting and right-defying environmental regulations than are conservatives. To take another example, illegal immigrants. Like liberals focus on how that illegal immigrants are suffering in cages and really coming to harm at the hands of unscrupulous smugglers, whereas conservatives are more likely to see illegal immigrants not as victims but as villains, right, perpetrating harm to Americans. So I think when you make sense of how people perceive the minds of others, then you can make sense of moral judgments. And to go back of,
it's not the minds of others, it's the overall body, it's the complete package, it's the physiology. This idea that you can just isolate people just to their cognition, just to their mind, is a liberal enlightenment left-wing delusion. So I recently put down $140 for a year of ad-free Peacock, and I want to get my money's worth. So I was looking around on the service last night, and I found a terrific new series. It's called Lockerbie, A Search for Truth. So remember, Pan Am Flight 103 explodes over Lockerbie, Scotland, 38 minutes after takeoff on December 21, 1988, killing 259 on board and 11 on the ground. And this British doctor loses his daughter, and he seeks the truth about what really happened. So it's based on a true story, something about, and it's a 5-part miniseries that's on Peacock.
When I said it seems true that moral foundations theory is ahead, I think it only again seems that it's ahead. And I think one of the biggest problems I have with moral foundations theory is that it purports to explain differences between liberals and conservatives, but I think it really just names those differences. And I think we have to be really careful about our terminology here, because when you explain something, you take it and you tie it to something deeper, right? Like in the kind of like what underlies the world? Well, there's turtles, right? Let's say, right? And you can't just say like, you can't just explain something by just calling it a name, right? And so I should have a good analogy here, but I'm just going to go straight to what. Well, so here's an analogy, right? Let's say you observe a bird flying, and you think that's incredible, and you see a bunny not flying, and you say, well, why can the robin fly and the rabbit cannot fly? One example you could say is, look, the bird has this flying foundation, right? It has this ability to fly, and the rabbit doesn't have that flying foundation, and so it can't fly. But really, all I've done is I've just said there's this difference between them. I've given it a name that seems kind of powerful, but it doesn't explain it, and so.
Okay, this is the conclusion of Halperin's show tonight.
Before, and this is, to me, it's of a piece, and it's not a coincidence, with liberals who gave the universities suddenly stopping after what happened with Gaza and the Palestinians. Right, that was a watershed moment for the left, where they said, we're no longer going to fund this kind of behavior at universities, and that critique extended to a wider circle of other things that happen on campuses. We're seeing now liberal celebrities criticize the Democratic Party because of the fires. In a way, Rob, back me up. We've never seen this, right? All right.
No.
So go ahead and put this tweet up. One of the leading liberals who's been tweeting against the Democratic Party is Justine Bateman. Now, I don't know, was she a doctrinaire liberal before all this started? This is just her latest tweet. Karen Bass, Gavin Newsom were like two players on a baseball team that don't go to practice, don't train, and hope the ball isn't hit to them in the outfield. But they sure like wearing those uniforms, hanging out in the dugout, and taking champagne showers in the locker room when we win. We, the voters, need to be the general manager of Team California and Los Angeles and get these people off the roster. Again, I don't know that she was a huge liberal, but she certainly is being outspoken now. So let me ask Rob, since you know the most about this world, is this something that could see a sea change? Donald Trump has lusted after more celebrity support. Is this something that could actually move liberal Hollywood away from the Democratic Party?
I think it could. So Justine's been red-pilled for a little while, but it's because of California. That a lot to do with homelessness and crime, how this event's happened, and she's been speaking out. If you go back to the mayor's race, where Rick Caruso, who was a former Republican, he had switched to Democrat, but he was the proxy Republican in the race against Karen Bass. That Hollywood was divided.
That's right.
Rick had a lot of celebrity support. And again, he wasn't brand Republican anymore, but he was the conservative, the more conservative candidate in that race. And so from a local governance perspective, yes, people that lived there, that were scared about crime, that were tired of homelessness, were more than happy to move towards a more conservative candidate. And they just elected a former Republican, essentially a Republican district attorney in Los Angeles County this past election, throwing out Gascon, who was a progressive. So yeah, and the industry's suffering, as we all know as well. So it is a distressing time for a lot of these Californians, these folks. And I don't know if they go all the way to Trump, but I think they would coalesce around people like Caruso or other candidates for governor and mayor that may not be traditional Democrats.
Carrie Underwood is performing at the Trump Environment, so there's that.
Now, Kip says, why is it always about Lockerbie? All right, the United States shut down Iran Air 655, killed 290 Iranians. Yeah, because Iranians are them, and the people on the plane that went down in Lockerbie are us, and a normal, natural, healthy thing to do is to care more about us rather than about them. So I have no problem that we have more news media and entertainment focus on our suffering as opposed to their suffering. But of course, there are benefits to taking the 10,000 foot level and recognize the United States is something horrendous, shooting down an Iranian passenger jetliner, killing approximately 290 people. But there's nothing wrong with having tribal inclinations. Right. What are the bases of our moral inclinations? Back to this discussion with Professor Kurt Gray.
What you need to do is you need to think about the kind of ingredients that make it up. And I think that's what dyadic morality can do, right? Rather than just say, like, look, liberals and conservatives disagree because we have different moral foundations, which it turns out don't exist in the mind. And so they're just different values, right? Then it's tautological. Conservatives think that loyalty is important because loyalty is important. But what dyadic morality does is it provides the kind of cognitive framework to make sense of those differences and generate new differences. If you go to a new culture and someone thinks, look, this particular tree is very vulnerable to harm and it's important to our society, then anyone who kicks that tree, I would imagine, is seen to do an immoral thing. And so in that sense, it's kind of more generative than moral foundations, which just says there's 5 values and people care about those more or less.
Yeah, I mean, you've got great.
Okay, let's leave it there. I want to go back to watching this Lockerbie, A Search for Truth miniseries on Peacock. I'll